I spent 16 years turning a failing Texas data center into a multi-million-dollar empire. But when my boss handed my entire career over to his clueless 22-year-old son and told me to go pack up my desk, he had no idea that I held the legal right to pull the plug on his entire operation. My name is Kendra, and I am 34 years old. If you have ever had an arrogant boss hand your hard-earned career to their entitled kid, hit that like and subscribe button. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from. You will not believe how fast his empire burned to the ground. The humming of the server racks was the soundtrack of my entire adult life. I was standing in the middle of the primary data floor of Apex Solutions. The cold air conditioning bit through my blazer, a constant reminder of the massive cooling systems keeping millions of medical records safe. I knew every wire, every switch, and every emergency protocol in this building because I had written most of them myself. Over the past decade and a half, I had memorized the exact pitch of the cooling fans. I could tell if a server was overheating just by the subtle change in the mechanical vibration vibrating through the raised floor tiles. This place was my sanctuary, my masterpiece. I turned around when I heard the heavy security doors hiss open. Harrison, the owner of the company, walked in, wearing his usual tailored suit. Right behind him was Brian, his 22-year-old son, who had just graduated from university with a degree in something utterly unrelated to technology. Brian was wearing expensive loafers and a smirk that immediately made my stomach tighten. Kendra Harrison began, his voice echoing slightly over the roar of the servers. I need you to gather your personal items from the director office by the end of the day. Brian is stepping in as the new data center operations director. He is going to modernize the place. I stared at him. The words did not make sense. I blinked, looking from Harrison to Brian, who was casually flipping a brand new master access keycard between his fingers. The highest security clearance level. A level that took me a decade of flawless performance to earn. He had been handed the keys to the kingdom without knowing a single thing about the locks. Wait, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the sudden pounding in my chest. You are replacing me. I have run this facility for the last 8 years. We just secured the largest healthcare consortium in the state because of my infrastructure design. Harrison waved his hand dismissively, as if swatting away a fly. You have done a fine job maintaining things, Kendra, but it is time for fresh blood. Brian has new ideas. Do not worry, we are not firing you. You are going to move down to the administrative wing in the basement. You will handle the compliance paperwork and support Brian while he learns the ropes. A windowless office in the basement. Doing paperwork for a boy who did not know the difference between a router and a radiator. The sheer audacity of the demotion stole the breath from my lungs. The heat of betrayal burned in my chest, replacing the cold air of the server room. I had sacrificed holidays, birthdays, and relationships for this company. I had treated Apex Solutions like it was my own, and in return, I was being discarded like obsolete hardware. My mind flashed back to when I was 18 years old. I had started here on the night shift monitoring outdated servers while studying networking manuals under a desk lamp. I gave my youth to this concrete bunker. I spent 16 years climbing from a minimum wage technician to the director of operations. I spent countless weekends sleeping on a cot in the break room during hurricane season to ensure the backup generators kept the hospital databases online. I built this facility from a crumbling local storage center into a multi-million-dollar hub that held the critical data of 3 major medical networks: live patient records, surgical schedules, emergency room diversion protocols. It was all running perfectly because I sacrificed my personal life to ensure zero downtime. My sweat, my stress, and my intellect were woven into the very cables around us. I hear you are pretty good at the boring stuff, Brian chimed in. His voice had that grating, unearned confidence of someone who had never faced a real consequence in his life. Do not worry, Kendra. I will make sure the transition is smooth. Just send me all the passwords by noon. I want to tweak the power consumption settings today. My dad says our electric bill is way too high. I looked at Brian. He wanted to tweak the power consumption on a Texas data center in the middle of summer. He had absolutely zero IT experience. He did not know that dropping the power to the cooling pumps by even 10% would trigger a thermal runaway within hours. The servers would literally melt. He was holding a loaded gun and asking where the safety switch was so he could turn it off to save a few pennies. My initial instinct was to scream. I wanted to list my certifications, my late nights, the millions of dollars my protocols had saved this company over the years. I wanted to beg Harrison to see reason, to look at the numbers, to realize that putting his inexperienced son in charge of critical medical data was an act of corporate suicide. I wanted to remind him of the time I manually patched the cooling lines during the Great Freeze, saving his business from total bankruptcy while he was vacationing in Aspen. But as I looked at Harrison's cold, calculating eyes and Brian's arrogant grin, a profound clarity washed over me. They did not respect me. They saw me as a placeholder, a glorified babysitter who had simply kept the seat warm until the golden child was old enough to claim his throne. They believed my loyalty was absolute and my submission was guaranteed. What they completely failed to realize was that I was not just an employee. Over the years, because Harrison was too cheap and too lazy to invest in proper corporate infrastructure, I had personally established an independent LLC to handle the secure cloud backup environments. The medical consortiums trusted me, not Harrison. My proprietary systems were the only thing keeping those massive contracts legally binding. By demoting me, Harrison had just handed me the legal right to walk away with his most valuable assets. I held the kill switch to the entire operation, and he had just dared me to press it. Harrison clapped his hands together, a sharp sound that barely pierced the mechanical roar of the server racks. "All right then," he said, checking his heavy gold watch. "Let us get this transition started. I want you to spend the rest of the morning walking Brian through the network architecture. Show him how to access the cooling mainframes and give him a rundown of the security clearance protocols. Tomorrow morning, you start in the basement." I looked at the man I had dedicated my entire adult life to serving. I looked at the dark bags under my eyes reflected in the glass of the server cabinet next to me. I thought about the holidays I missed, the family dinners I skipped, the sheer panic of keeping this place online through ice storms and grid failures. I had literally bled for Apex Solutions. And here was my reward: a windowless room and a demotion to assist a boy who looked like he belonged at a frat party rather than a Tier 4 data center. I took a deep breath. The chilled air filled my lungs, clearing my mind of any lingering loyalty or doubt. I reached up and unclipped my security badge from my blazer lapel. The plastic ID card felt heavy in my hand. It represented 16 years of my life. I let it go. The badge dropped onto the metal server rack with a sharp clatter. "No," I said quietly. My voice was calm, devoid of any anger or tears. "I will not be doing that." Harrison frowned, his thick eyebrows pulling together in confusion. "Excuse me, I gave you a direct order, Kendra. You need to train my son." "I am done here," I said, looking him dead in the eyes. "I quit, effective immediately." For a second, the only sound in the room was the deafening hum of thousands of hard drives. Harrison's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. The casual arrogance completely vanished, replaced by the explosive anger of a man who was not used to hearing the word no. "You cannot quit," Harrison yelled, stepping toward me. "You are under contract. You have a duty to this company. You are going to walk my son through those protocols right now, or I will make sure you never work in this industry again." I stood my ground. "My employment is at will, Harrison. Check the Human Resources Handbook, the same handbook you are having me go update in the basement. I am walking out that door and I am not looking back." Do you have any idea who you are dealing with? He roared, spit flying from his lips. I play golf with the board members of every major tech firm in Texas. I will blackball you across the entire state. I will make a few phone calls before lunch and your reputation will be absolutely destroyed. You will be lucky to get a job fixing broken cell phones at a mall kiosk. I felt a cold smile form on my lips. Go ahead. Call them. Tell them you just fired the only person who actually knows how to keep their medical data secure. Brian scoffed, crossing his arms over his expensive shirt. God, you are so dramatic. Let her go, Dad. We do not need her anyway. It is just managing servers. It is basic IT. I took a whole semester on network administration in college. I can figure out how to keep a room cold. Basic IT, I repeated softly, staring at the 22-year-old who was about to inherit a ticking time bomb. Right. Just basic IT. You realize we are hosting live surgical feeds and emergency dispatch data for 3 hospital networks, right? If your cooling system goes down, you have exactly 12 minutes before the servers initiate an emergency thermal shutdown. Brian rolled his eyes. I know how a thermostat works, Kendra. Just leave. We have real work to do. Yes, Harrison snarled, pointing a shaking finger at the heavy metal exit doors. Get out of my building. You are making the biggest mistake of your pathetic life. And do not think you are taking any of your work with you. Every password, every protocol, every line of code you wrote belongs to Apex Solutions. Not quite, I replied. I turned around and walked over to my secure terminal. I picked up my leather purse, slinging it over my shoulder. What Harrison completely failed to understand was the legal reality of our relationship. Years ago, when we first landed the massive medical consortium contract, Harrison had refused to pay for the expensive, specialized disaster recovery software required by federal healthcare regulations. He said it would eat into his profit margins, so I had built the infrastructure myself. I formed my own independent company and developed a proprietary cloud backup and disaster recovery protocol. Because Harrison hated reading legal documents, he had blindly signed the service agreement I presented to him. That agreement clearly stated that Apex Solutions was merely licensing my software. My independent company owned the intellectual property, the encryption keys, and the disaster recovery protocols. By forcing me out, Harrison was simultaneously terminating the license agreement. I was taking the sole safety net of his entire operation out the door with me. And without that safety net, his multi-million-dollar medical contracts were virtually useless. I looked around the massive data center one last time. I felt a strange sense of peace. I had built this empire, and now I was leaving it in the hands of 2 arrogant fools who had no idea how to maintain it. Good luck with the electric bill, Brian, I said, my voice completely steady. I turned my back on the 2 of them and walked straight toward the exit. Harrison was suddenly screaming, shouting something about expensive corporate lawyers and massive civil lawsuits right behind me. But his desperate voice was completely drowned out by the steady mechanical roar of the cooling servers. I confidently pushed open the heavy security doors and stepped out of the main server room. The massive, heavy metal slab clicked shut firmly behind me, instantly sealing them inside their own inevitable disaster. I walked down the long, familiar corridor straight out the glass front doors of the commercial building and stepped directly into the bright Texas morning sunlight. I paused for a moment and took a deep breath of fresh, warm air. My restrictive career inside that suffocating place was officially over, but my own real power was just beginning to take shape today. I woke up the next morning to the unfamiliar sensation of sunlight warming my face. For the first time in 16 years, my sleep had not been interrupted by automated server alerts or frantic texts from night shift technicians. I stretched my arms, feeling a profound sense of physical and mental relief. I walked into my kitchen, brewed a strong pot of dark roast coffee, and finally looked at my personal cell phone sitting on the granite counter. The screen was completely covered in notifications. There were 42 missed calls. Most of them were from the main switchboard at Apex Solutions. A dozen more were from Harrison's personal cell phone. My text message inbox was flooded with urgent alerts from automated internal systems, proving that the junior technicians were already triggering minor alarms, trying to navigate the back end without my guidance. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the rich flavor. The chaotic energy that usually dictated my mornings was completely gone. I was no longer the shield protecting Harrison's empire from his own incompetence. I sat down at my kitchen island and watched the screen light up again. This time the incoming call was from my old direct extension, the Data Center Operations Director line. I smiled, tapped the green button, and put the phone on speaker. "Hello," I said, keeping my tone light and entirely unbothered. "Kendra, it is about time you answered your phone," Brian barked through the speaker. He was trying to lower his voice to sound authoritative, clearly attempting a pathetic imitation of his father's aggressive management style. "You have a lot of explaining to do. I have been sitting at this desk since 7 in the morning, trying to access the primary cooling loop controls. The entire interface is locked behind an encryption wall." "Good morning to you too, Brian," I replied, taking another leisurely sip of my coffee. "How is the new office? I hope the ergonomic chair is comfortable. I specifically ordered it for my back pain, but I am sure it suits your needs just fine." "Do not play games with me," Brian snapped. The false confidence in his voice was already beginning to fracture. "My dad is furious. We are trying to run a diagnostic on the HVAC power consumption to present to the board this afternoon. We need to manually lower the output of the secondary chillers to prove my new efficiency model works. But the system is demanding a 12-digit administrative override code. Give it to me right now." I leaned back in my chair. He actually wanted to throttle the secondary chillers during a Texas summer. The sheer stupidity of his plan was almost breathtaking. The cooling system was not a toy you could just dial down to save a few bucks on an electric bill. It was a finely tuned ecosystem, keeping millions of dollars of hardware from melting into slag. "I cannot help you with that, Brian," I said calmly. "I do not work for Apex Solutions anymore. You have the master access keycard. You should be able to figure it out with all that basic IT knowledge you bragged about yesterday." "Listen to me very carefully," Brian threatened, his voice rising in panic and anger. "You are deliberately sabotaging this company. My dad has already authorized payroll to freeze your final paycheck. We are not paying you a single dime until you surrender those override passwords. And if you do not comply by noon today, we are calling our corporate attorneys. We will press charges against you for corporate espionage and stealing company secrets. You will be ruined." I actually laughed out loud. The sound echoed in my quiet kitchen. "Brian, you really should have read the vendor contracts before taking over the director seat. Or at least had your father's lawyers look at them before you started making threats you cannot back up." "What are you talking about?" he demanded. "I did not steal any company secrets," I explained, speaking slowly and clearly as if addressing a toddler. "The emergency cooling protocols, the thermal failsafes, and the disaster recovery encryption keys were never the intellectual property of Apex Solutions. Your father refused to pay for enterprise-grade software 5 years ago. He told me to figure it out on a budget. So I built a custom software architecture under my own independent tech firm. I own the copyright." I paused to let that information sink into his arrogant brain. I could hear him breathing heavily into the receiver. "I licensed that software to Apex Solutions on an annual basis," I continued. "The terms of that license explicitly stated that the software agreement remained valid only as long as I was retained as the primary director of operations. When your father forced me out of my position yesterday, he legally breached that contract. At exactly midnight last night, My software recognized the termination of my employment status and automatically revoked its own licensing access. You are locked out because the system legally belongs to me, and you no longer have my permission to use it. You cannot do that, Brian stammered, all his false bravado entirely gone. We have live medical data on these servers. You have to turn it back on. My dad will sue you into bankruptcy. Your dad can try, I replied coldly. But my contracts are ironclad. I highly suggest you do not try to bypass the encryption firewall manually. If you force a hard reset on those cooling pumps without the proper sequencing codes, you will trigger a system-wide pressure fault. The ambient temperature will spike immediately. Enjoy your new job, Brian. Kendra, wait, you have to, Brian pleaded. I ended the call and immediately blocked the number. I walked over to my living room window and looked out at the cloudless blue sky. The morning news playing on my television was already predicting a record-breaking heat wave rolling across Texas by the afternoon. Temperatures were expected to hit triple digits and stay there for the next week. The state power grid would be pushed to its absolute limits, meaning the data center would be entirely reliant on the delicate mechanical balance of my locked cooling protocols. I had spent years meticulously calibrating those specific industrial chillers to compensate for the highly unstable external power supply. The stage was perfectly set. Harrison and Brian were locked inside a massive concrete oven filled with heat-generating servers. They had no access to the automated safety protocols, no understanding of the complex infrastructure, and absolutely no way to manage the crushing thermal load that was about to hit them. Their own blinding arrogance had stripped away their only protection. I set my coffee mug down, feeling absolute certainty that their stolen empire was about to burn. I left my kitchen and grabbed my car keys. The drive across town to my sister Samantha's house took 45 minutes. The relentless Texas sun beat down on the highway, a reminder of the heat wave baking the state. But as I pulled into Samantha's quiet, tree-lined suburban driveway, the oppressive heat seemed to fade away. Walking into her home was like stepping into a different world. The air inside was cool and smelled richly of roasted garlic thyme and fresh baking bread. Samantha was standing at the kitchen island, pouring a glass of red wine. She looked up and smiled brightly. There was no corporate tension here. There were no flashing server alerts or arrogant bosses demanding impossible tasks. This was a sanctuary of genuine warmth and familial support, a stark and beautiful contrast to the sterile, toxic concrete bunker I had spent the last 16 years inhabiting. I hugged my sister tightly, letting out a long exhale that carried away the remaining stress of the morning. She handed me a glass of wine and pointed toward the dining room table, set with fine china and silver. I walked into the dining room and took a seat just as the front door opened. Jamal, Samantha's husband, walked in, carrying a heavy briefcase. Jamal was an African-American corporate attorney, and even after a 12-hour day at his downtown firm, he looked immaculate. He wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit with a crisp white shirt and a silk tie. Jamal possessed a brilliant analytical mind and a reputation for being utterly ruthless in a courtroom. He was a partner, specializing in corporate compliance and contract litigation. More importantly, his firm represented the massive healthcare consortium that was currently the largest and most lucrative client using Harrison's data center. Jamal set his briefcase down, loosened his tie just a fraction, and greeted me with a warm smile. He had always respected my work ethic, often joking that we were the only two people in the family who truly understood the crushing weight of high-stakes corporate responsibility. We sat down at the large oak dining table as Samantha brought over a massive platter of roasted chicken and vegetables. The dinner conversation started off casually. Jamal asked about my week, expecting my usual exhausted complaints about ungrateful executives and failing hardware. I took a slow sip of my wine, savoring the rich flavor, and placed my glass gently on the table. I looked at Jamal and Samantha and calmly announced that I no longer worked for Apex Solutions. Samantha gasped, dropping her fork. Jamal, however, simply froze. He had chicken halfway to his mouth, but he lowered his fork back to his plate. The warm, casual atmosphere of the family dinner instantly shifted into something highly focused and intensely serious. Jamal shifted into his lawyer persona seamlessly. His sharp eyes locked onto mine, devoid of their previous warmth, replaced by cold, calculating professional interest. He knew exactly how vital my specific expertise was to his client's massive medical infrastructure. He knew the intricate details of the service-level agreements because he was the one who had drafted the original compliance requirements on behalf of the hospital network years ago. "Tell me everything," Jamal said, his voice dropping an octave. "Leave out zero details. I want to know exactly what happened from the moment you walked into the building yesterday morning." I took a deep breath and recounted the entire humiliating ordeal. I described how Harrison had ambushed me in the main server room. I repeated Harrison's exact words about moving me to a windowless basement office to do administrative paperwork. I explained the sheer absurdity of being ordered to train Brian, a 22-year-old college graduate with absolutely zero relevant information technology experience or network administration certifications. I detailed Brian's arrogant behavior, his flippant comments about basic IT, and his incredibly dangerous desire to manually throttle the secondary chillers during a historic heatwave to save money on the electric bill. I left nothing out. I told Jamal about my refusal to train the boy, my resignation, and the furious threats Harrison had hurled at my back as I walked out of the facility. Finally, I explained the phone call from this morning, detailing how my proprietary software license had automatically revoked their access to the critical emergency cooling controls. Jamal listened in absolute silence. He did not interrupt me once. He did not offer any sympathetic platitudes or emotional comfort. He just absorbed the information, like a supercomputer processing raw data. When I finished speaking, the dining room was completely quiet. Samantha looked horrified, staring at me with wide eyes, clearly appalled by the profound disrespect I had endured after 16 years of unwavering loyalty to that company. But Jamal had a completely different reaction. A slow, dangerous smile crept across his face. It was the exact same smile he wore right before he dismantled an opposing counsel's argument in a high-profile trial. He picked up his napkin, wiped his mouth, and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the oak table. "Kendra," he said softly, his eyes practically gleaming with legal anticipation. "I need you to confirm something for me very carefully. Are you absolutely certain that Harrison explicitly stated he was replacing you as the data center operations director with his son? Did he officially strip you of your title and your primary operational duties before you resigned?" I nodded without hesitation. "Yes," I replied firmly. "He stated Brian was stepping in as the new director immediately. He told me to pack my things and move to the basement. I was completely removed from the operational command chain." Jamal sat back in his chair and let out a low whistle. He reached for his phone, his dinner entirely forgotten. "Harrison is a fool," Jamal whispered, his voice trembling slightly with restrained excitement. "A massive, arrogant fool who just handed us the keys to his entire kingdom." Jamal did not even apologize to Samantha as he pushed his plate of roasted chicken aside. He reached into his heavy leather briefcase sitting on the floor next to him and pulled out his sleek silver laptop. He flipped it open right there on the dining room table, the bright screen illuminating his face in the dimly lit room. His fingers flew across the keyboard with practiced speed, navigating through secure corporate network portals and encrypted legal databases. I watched him work, fascinated by the sudden shift in his demeanor. He was no longer just my brother-in-law enjoying a Sunday family dinner. He was a corporate apex predator who had just smelled blood in the water. Samantha sighed softly, picked up Jamal's plate, and walked back into the kitchen to keep his dinner warm. She knew better than to interrupt him when he was in this specific zone. I took another sip of my red wine and waited patiently. The silence in the dining room was thick, broken only by the rapid clacking of the laptop keys. After about 3 minutes of intense searching, Jamal hit the enter key one final time and spun the laptop around so the screen faced me. "Look at this, Kendra," Jamal commanded, pointing a long finger at a dense block of legal text on the screen. "Read it carefully." I leaned in and squinted at the bright display. It was a scanned PDF document. I recognized the letterhead immediately. It was the Master Service Level Agreement, the SLA between Apex Solutions and the Primary Texas Medical Consortium. This was the exact contract that generated 70% of Harrison's annual revenue. It was a massive multi-million-dollar deal that I had personally spent 6 months helping secure by proving our infrastructure could handle their immense data loads with absolute reliability. "Scroll down to section 4.2, Jamal instructed, tapping the glass screen. "The key personnel clause." I scrolled down the document and began to read the dense legal jargon out loud. "The client agrees to the terms of this service level agreement under the strict condition that the vendor retains specific, qualified individuals in primary operational roles. These individuals are designated as key personnel. The removal, reassignment, or termination of any key personnel without a minimum of 90 days prior written notice to the client and without providing an equally certified and experienced replacement acceptable to the client constitutes a material breach of this entire contract." I looked up from the screen, my heart beating a little faster. I read the addendum listed right below the paragraph. There was only one name listed under the key personnel designation for the entire facility. My name. Kendra Davis, Data Center Operations Director. "Do you see what he did?" Jamal asked, a fierce grin spreading across his face. "When I drafted this agreement for the hospital network 3 years ago, they were incredibly hesitant to sign with Apex Solutions. They knew Harrison was cheap. They knew his hardware was aging. The only reason they agreed to move their live medical databases into that facility was because of you. The medical board trusted your track record. They trusted your custom disaster recovery protocols. I specifically wrote this clause to ensure Harrison could not fire you and replace you with some cut-rate amateur to save money. Your presence was the linchpin holding this multi-million-dollar deal together." I stared at the screen, the magnitude of Harrison's mistake washing over me. "He did not give them 90 days' notice," I whispered. "He did not give them 90 minutes. He just swapped me out for Brian." "Exactly," Jamal said, his eyes practically glowing with predatory delight. "Brian holds a generic liberal arts degree and has 0 technical certifications. He is legally and factually an unqualified replacement. By stripping you of your title and handing your security clearance to his son Harrison, has fundamentally and irreparably breached the master contract. The medical consortium has the legal right to void the agreement immediately, pull all their data, and demand a full refund for the current billing cycle." I felt a surge of vindication. It was beautiful. Harrison had dug his own grave simply because he was too arrogant to read the very contracts that kept his lights on. I reached for my wine glass, ready to celebrate. "So you are going to call the medical board tomorrow morning," I said. "You are going to tell them what happened and pull the contract. Harrison will be ruined by Tuesday." Jamal reached across the table and gently pushed my wine glass down. He shook his head slowly, his grin widening into something distinctly dangerous. "No, Kendra, that is not how we are going to play this." I frowned, confused. "Why not?" "You just said he breached the contract. If I call them tomorrow and pull the contract, Harrison loses the medical consortium." Jamal explained, leaning back in his chair and steepling his fingers. Yes, he will lose a ton of money, but he will survive. He will downsize, sell off some assets, and probably blame the whole thing on you to save face in the industry. He will claim you quit suddenly and left him in a bind. We are not going to give him the opportunity to spin a false narrative. We are not just going to cost him a contract. We are going to completely dismantle his entire empire. I listened intently, entirely captivated by the ruthless legal strategy unfolding in front of me. How do we do that? I asked. We wait, Jamal said softly. We do absolutely nothing. He spun the laptop back around and scrolled down to the penalty section of the agreement. The key personnel breach gives us the right to walk away, but if we wait for them to fail operationally, we trigger the catastrophic penalty clauses. Look at this section here. If the primary servers experience an unscheduled downtime exceeding 4 hours due to vendor negligence, the vendor is liable for direct financial damages to the hospital network. We are talking about tens of millions of dollars in fines for disrupting emergency medical services. Jamal closed the laptop with a decisive snap. Right now, Harrison and Brian are sitting in a massive room full of highly sensitive servers during a historic Texas heatwave. You locked them out of the automated cooling controls because you legally revoked their software license. Brian has no idea how to manage the thermal load. They are flying a jumbo jet completely blind. It is not a matter of if they crash, Kendra. It is a matter of when. I pictured Brian sitting at my old desk, frantically trying to guess the encryption passwords, while the internal ambient temperature slowly began to climb. I pictured Harrison, arrogantly assuming everything was fine. When the heat wave breaks that system, Jamal continued, his voice perfectly calm and terrifyingly cold. When the servers overheat and the medical databases go dark, it shifts from a simple contract dispute to gross criminal negligence. The hospitals will be unable to access patient records. Surgeries will be delayed. Emergency rooms will have to divert ambulances. The liability will be astronomical. And when the dust settles, I will personally file the lawsuit that bankrupts Harrison, seizes his assets, and ensures he never owns a business in this state again. We are going to let them destroy themselves. All we have to do is sit back, relax, and watch the temperature rise. Jamal picked up his fork and finally took a bite of his cold chicken. He chewed thoughtfully, nodded in satisfaction, and looked at me across the table. So, he said casually, "What are we having for dessert?" We decided to skip dessert entirely. The adrenaline coursing through my veins completely killed my appetite. I drove home under the cover of darkness, the oppressive Texas heat still radiating from the asphalt even at 10 at night. When I walked into my quiet living room, I tossed my keys on the console table and finally looked at my personal cell phone. It was vibrating, continuously vibrating so hard it was slowly sliding across the granite countertop of my kitchen island. I picked it up and saw an avalanche of frantic text messages in the group chat I shared with my former senior technicians. These were the loyal guys who actually kept the hardware running while management slept. Marcus, my lead floor supervisor, who had been with the company for 12 years, was sending messages in all capital letters. I scrolled to the top of the unread notifications to piece together the chaos unfolding back at the data center. Marcus had sent the first message around 6 in the evening. He wrote that Brian had strutted onto the primary server floor, holding a clipboard, loudly declaring that he was going to optimize the facility power consumption to impress his father. Brian had apparently read a single blog post about green energy efficiency and decided to apply it to a Tier 4 medical data center without consulting anyone. The messages from the other technicians painted a terrifying picture. Brian was manually overriding the automated load balancers. He was purposely shutting down the secondary liquid cooling pumps in Zone 3 to reduce the overall electrical draw. Zone 3 housed the live emergency dispatch servers for the entire Dallas Metroplex. I read the next series of texts, my stomach dropping despite the legal reassurances I received at dinner. Marcus had tried to intervene. He sent a long message explaining how he had physically stepped in front of the control console to block Brian. Marcus had desperately tried to explain the fragile balance of the Texas power grid during a summer heat wave. He warned the 22-year-old that the HVAC limits were already pushed to 90% capacity. If the local grid experienced even a minor brownout, those secondary pumps were the only things keeping the ambient temperature from spiking into the danger zone. You cannot run a medical data center on a razor-thin margin just to save a few $100s on the monthly utility bill. The heat generation from thousands of processors running complex healthcare algorithms requires massive redundant cooling. Brian did not listen. The final message from Marcus was a picture of him standing in the sweltering employee parking lot, holding a cardboard box of his desk belongings. Brian had fired him on the spot. He fired a 12-year veteran technician in front of the entire night shift simply to assert his dominance and silence any opposition. Brian had yelled that he was the director now, and anyone who questioned his authority would be replaced by tomorrow morning. He called Marcus an obsolete dinosaur who did not understand modern business. The remaining technicians were terrified. They were watching the ambient temperature gauges slowly tick upward, completely paralyzed by the threat of losing their livelihoods. Brian had officially removed the absolute last line of defense between his own staggering incompetence and total catastrophic failure. A few days ago, reading those messages would have sent me into a full-blown panic attack. I would have driven straight back to the facility, badge or no badge, and physically forced Brian away from the controls to save the network. But tonight, standing in the cool quiet of my own home, I felt absolutely nothing but cold detachment. I did not reply to the group chat. I could not risk leaving a digital trail that showed I was still involved or advising them in any capacity. Jamal had made the legal strategy perfectly clear. I had to let the failure happen organically. I put my phone on silent, flipped it face down on the kitchen counter, and walked down the hallway to my home office. I sat down at my heavy wooden desk and woke up my custom-built terminal. The massive curved monitor flared to life, casting a blue glow across the dark room. I bypassed the standard commercial operating systems and booted directly into my encrypted Linux environment. It was time to initiate my countermove. While Harrison thought the only value I brought to the table was managing his physical cooling units, I had spent the last 3 years silently building an impenetrable digital fortress. Through my independent tech firm, the same one holding the now revoked software license, I had constructed a massive secondary cloud infrastructure. It was a completely legal, fully compliant shadow network hosted on decentralized servers spread across 3 different states, far away from the fragile Texas power grid. Every single piece of critical medical data, every surgical schedule, and every patient history that currently sat on Harrison's doomed physical servers was safely mirrored in my secure cloud. The hospital consortium had no idea this shadow network existed, yet because I had built it as a failsafe for this exact scenario. I cracked my knuckles and began typing complex command strings into the terminal interface. I initiated the final boot sequence for the backup architecture. Lines of green code cascaded down the screen as the virtual servers spun up to full capacity. They were perfectly optimized and entirely ready to catch the massive data load the moment Harrison's physical facility inevitably melted down. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and watched the system finalize its deployment. The transition was flawless. The digital safety net was now fully operational and waiting for my command. I was no longer trying to stop the disaster from striking the physical building. I was building the only life raft, and I was going to make both of them pay a very heavy price for a single boarding ticket tonight. The sun rose the next morning not with light, but with a suffocating blanket of brutal, punishing heat. By 8 o'clock, the local news anchors were already sweating on live television. The meteorologists were standing in front of dark red weather maps, loudly declaring this a record-breaking, once-in-a-generation Texas heat wave. The state utility regulators were sending out emergency broadcast alerts to every cellular device in the county, begging residents to raise their thermostats to 78 degrees to prevent a total collapse of the fragile power grid. Rolling blackouts were already sweeping through residential neighborhoods. The asphalt on the street outside my window literally shimmered in the morning light, radiating heat like an open oven door. A data center is essentially a massive concrete box filled with thousands of mechanical space heaters. To keep those servers from catching fire on a normal day requires a staggering amount of electricity. On a day like today, with the external ambient temperature rocketing past 110 degrees, keeping the facility cool required every single ounce of redundant power flowing through the primary grid. The delicate balance I had spent 16 years maintaining was being pushed to its absolute physical limits. And sitting at the helm of this strained, highly volatile mechanical ecosystem was a boy who just wanted to prove a point. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and sat on my living room couch, watching the news coverage with a detached sense of irony. The city was preparing for a massive infrastructure crisis, completely unaware that a far more localized and devastating catastrophe was being manufactured right in their backyard. The sheer incompetence of nepotism was about to collide violently with the uncompromising reality of thermodynamics. I did not need to be standing inside the building to know exactly what Brian was doing. The arrogance of an unqualified manager always follows a very predictable and destructive pattern. Brian was sitting in my old chair looking at the operational dashboard. He was not seeing a fragile network of life-saving medical data. He was seeing a spreadsheet. He desperately wanted his very first monthly report as the new data center operations director to look spectacular. He wanted to walk into Harrison's opulent corner office at the end of the week and smugly slide a piece of paper across the polished mahogany desk, showing exactly how he had instantly cut operational costs by 20%. He wanted to prove his father right for firing the expensive veteran employee who always insisted on costly safety redundancies. In a desperate, reckless bid to manufacture those financial savings, Brian made the single most fatal mistake possible. Because I had legally locked him out of the automated environmental controls, he could not easily adjust the primary cooling loops through the software interface. But he possessed the physical master access keycard. Frustrated by the digital firewall, he simply walked down into the subterranean utility levels, completely bypassing the software protocols, and physically walked up to the massive industrial breaker boxes. To a novice like him, the secondary liquid cooling system was just an unnecessary redundancy, eating up massive amounts of expensive electricity. It was just a backup, and in his untrained mind, backups were a luxury they could afford to sacrifice for a better profit margin. He reached out and manually pulled the heavy steel levers downward, intentionally shutting off power to the entire secondary liquid cooling grid. The massive industrial pumps that circulated thousands of gallons of chilled glycol coolant through the floorboards ground to a complete and sudden halt. He thought he was being a corporate genius. He did not realize those secondary pumps were automatically designed to engage to offset the massive heat generation during extreme external weather events. He had just severed the main artery of the entire facility at exactly 10:15 in the morning. My personal cell phone buzzed violently against the glass surface of my coffee table. The vibration shattered the quiet calm of my living room. It was not a text message from a terrified former technician begging for help. It was a direct, automated system ping. Years ago, long before I ever conceptualized building my secondary cloud infrastructure, I had hard-coded a basic thermal alert script directly into the base motherboard of the primary zone servers. It was an ultimate failsafe, so deeply embedded in the physical hardware itself that even my own digital software lockout did not erase it. It bypassed all network firewalls and sent a raw SMS text message directly to my personal number if the physical environment breached safety protocols. I slowly picked up the phone and looked at the alert notification. The screen glowed with a flashing, urgent text box. Zone A, ambient temperature rising, current status 92 degrees Fahrenheit. I watched the glowing screen in complete, absolute, undisturbed silence. Exactly 10 minutes later, the phone buzzed a second time. Zone A, ambient temperature rising, current status 93 degrees Fahrenheit. I did the mental math instantly, drawing upon a decade and a half of facility knowledge. The internal temperature on the main server floor was rising by exactly 1 degree every 10 minutes. The absolute maximum thermal threshold for those specific high-performance medical servers was 115 degrees. Once the internal cabinet temperature hit that specific ceiling, the hardware safety locks would trigger a hard, non-negotiable system shutdown to prevent a literal electrical fire from destroying the building. It was no longer a hypothetical scenario discussed over dinner. It was no longer a distant possibility or a theoretical risk. The disaster was now an absolute, unavoidable physical certainty. I looked at the digital clock hanging on my kitchen wall. I had exactly 3 hours and 40 minutes until Harrison's entire multi-million-dollar operation melted into a puddle of useless silicon. The relentless countdown had officially started, and there was absolutely nothing they could ever do to stop it from happening. I had calculated 3 hours and 40 minutes until total failure, but I underestimated the sheer thermal mass of the massive concrete building. The heavy walls absorbed the initial shock of the Texas afternoon sun, delaying the inevitable just long enough to give Brian a false sense of absolute victory. He actually went home that evening, likely bragging to Harrison over an expensive dinner about how he had successfully optimized the grid without causing a single issue. But a data center never sleeps, and neither does the massive amount of heat generated by thousands of processors working together at maximum capacity. Without the secondary liquid cooling system running, the ambient temperature inside the facility continued to creep upward degree by agonizing degree, long after the hot Texas sun had finally set. The heavy air inside the windowless bunker grew thick, stagnant, and incredibly volatile, turning the entire room into a pressure cooker. At exactly 2 in the morning, the illusion of safety violently shattered. The automated alarms inside Harrison Data Center did not start with a gentle warning. They erupted with a deafening, piercing mechanical screech that echoed through every single concrete corridor. Strobe lights mounted on the ceiling began flashing a harsh, blinding red, painting the massive server racks in a terrifying emergency glow. The internal temperature in the primary server floor had officially breached 115 degrees Fahrenheit. The servers housing the critical medical records for the entire Texas Healthcare Consortium were literally baking from the inside out. The cooling fans built into the hardware chassis were spinning so fast they sounded like jet engines preparing for takeoff, whining in absolute mechanical agony as they desperately tried to push the boiling air out of the delicate motherboards. The physical smell of melting plastic and scorching silicon began to seep through the ventilation shafts. Brian had been fast asleep in his luxury apartment when his personal phone started screaming with automated emergency calls from the terrified night shift security guard. He rushed back to the facility in a sheer panic, sprinting through the heavy glass front doors, wearing only sweatpants and a wrinkled t-shirt. When he swiped his master access keycard and yanked open the heavy double doors to the main server floor, a solid wall of blistering, suffocating heat hit him directly in the face. It was like stepping into an active blast furnace. The noise was absolutely deafening. Brian stood in the center of the chaotic red room, completely and utterly paralyzed. The sheer magnitude of the disaster completely short-circuited his brain. He did not know how to read the complex alphanumeric error codes flashing frantically across the server monitors. He did not know which specific breaker box controlled the automated electrical failsafes. He suddenly realized that publicly firing Marcus, the veteran senior technician who actually understood this complex machinery, was the absolute most catastrophic mistake of his entire short life. Desperate to undo the damage, Brian sprinted toward the master control console. His hands were shaking violently as he grabbed the plastic computer mouse. He needed to manually jumpstart the secondary liquid chillers he had so arrogantly shut off yesterday morning. But he had completely forgotten that he bypassed the software interface earlier to violently pull the physical levers in the basement. Instead of running downstairs, his panicked brain told him to force the cooling system back online through the administrative software panel. He frantically typed his new username into the login screen. His hands were heavily sweating, slipping clumsily on the smooth plastic keyboard keys. He typed in his password and hit enter. The screen flashed a red error message indicating incorrect credentials. He cursed loudly, his heart pounding violently and erratically in his throat. He tried again, typing much faster this time, completely ignoring the warning prompt that explicitly stated the system would lock out all administrative access after 3 failed attempts to prevent a brute force cyber attack. He hit enter a third time. The screen instantly went entirely black, followed by a stark white padlock icon. He had just hard-locked the only digital control interface in the entire building. He was completely locked out of the administrative panel. Brian stumbled backward, away from the locked console, his chest heaving as he gasped for the thin, boiling air. He was trapped inside a massive oven of his own making, completely powerless to stop the impending destruction. At 2:15 in the morning, the heat finally won the brutal battle against the delicate hardware. It started in Zone A, the highly secure cluster of reinforced metal racks that house the primary emergency dispatch routing algorithms and live surgical schedules for 3 distinct hospital networks. The thermal sensors inside the server chassis recognized that the internal processors were mere milliseconds away from physically catching fire. Acting exactly as they were hardwired to do, the emergency fail-safes engaged to protect the physical hardware from literal combustion. A loud, echoing mechanical clack resonated through the boiling room. The blinding red emergency strobes illuminated the terrifying reality of what had just happened. Every single green status light on the Zone A server racks simultaneously blinked out. The deafening roar of the overworked internal cooling fans spun down into complete and total silence. Zone A went entirely dark. In a single fraction of a second, millions of highly sensitive medical data points were suddenly completely inaccessible. Doctors running night shifts in emergency rooms across the state were instantly met with blank screens. Ambulance drivers en route to critical trauma centers lost their digital routing coordinates. Live patient monitoring systems lost their historical baseline data. The catastrophic failure had officially breached the concrete walls of the data center and bled directly into the real world. Brian collapsed onto the hot, raised floor tiles, holding his head in his hands, finally realizing that his pathetic attempt to cut a few dollars from a utility bill had just jeopardized the lives of thousands of people. Miles away from the suffocating heat of the data center, I was sleeping soundly. My cloud infrastructure was deployed and standing by. At 2:30 in the morning, the shrill ringtone of my personal cell phone shattered the quiet darkness. I did not jolt awake. I slowly opened my eyes and looked at the glowing screen. The caller ID displayed Harrison's number. I let it ring 3 times, enjoying the visual confirmation that his stolen empire was crumbling exactly as Jamal predicted. I tapped answer, placed the phone on speaker, and walked into my kitchen to pour a cup of leftover coffee. Kendra Harrison screamed through the speaker. The audio distorted under the sheer volume of his panic. His voice was completely stripped of the condescending tone he weaponized against me yesterday. He sounded entirely unhinged, breathing heavily. Zone A is completely offline. The emergency fail-safes triggered and the entire medical dispatch cluster is dark. Hospital board members are calling my personal line, threatening to have me arrested. What did you do to my servers? I leaned against the granite counter and took a slow sip of my cold coffee. I did not do anything to your servers, Harrison, I replied smoothly. I am currently standing in my kitchen, doing absolutely nothing.
Do not lie to me,
He roared, his desperation rapidly twisting into vicious anger. You did this! You planted a malicious virus in the administrative backend before you walked out yesterday. You coded a logic bomb to shut down the thermal failsafes because you were jealous that I gave your job to Brian. I actually chuckled at the sheer absurdity of his accusation. Instead of taking a single ounce of responsibility for putting a 22-year-old amateur in charge of a highly complex mechanical ecosystem, Harrison was instantly trying to rewrite reality. He was desperately trying to gaslight me into believing I was the villain of a disaster he had entirely manufactured.
You are going to federal prison!
Harrison screamed, his voice echoing loudly. I am calling the FBI right now. I am pressing federal cyber terrorism charges against you. You intentionally sabotaged critical healthcare infrastructure. I will make sure you spend 20 years in a concrete cell. You have exactly 2 minutes to give me the decryption key to remove this virus, or I am sending the police to your house. His threats were completely empty, driven by the absolute terror of a man watching his bank accounts evaporate into thin air. He knew he was ruined, and he was flailing wildly in the dark for a scapegoat. Are you quite finished? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet and completely devoid of any emotion. Harrison stopped screaming, caught off guard by my absolute lack of fear. I could hear the faint, chaotic wailing of the data center emergency alarms echoing in the background of his phone call. The sound was music to my ears. I did not plant a virus, Harrison, I said, speaking slowly and distinctly so every single word would register in his panicked brain. Viruses attack software. You do not have a software problem. You have a massive hardware problem caused by catastrophic human error, and I can prove exactly who caused it. What are you talking about? He demanded, his breathing still ragged and loud. Open your laptop, I instructed coldly. Log into the security system and pull up camera feed 04. It is the camera positioned in the subterranean utility corridor right outside the main breaker room. Rewind the footage to exactly 9:45 yesterday morning. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I heard the frantic clicking of a computer mouse and the rapid tapping of keyboard keys. Harrison was desperate enough to follow my instructions without argument. Are you looking at the footage? I asked. Yes, Harrison whispered, his voice suddenly trembling. Tell me what you see, I demanded. I heard him swallow hard. I see Brian, he replied softly. Exactly, I said. Watch closely. He is walking right past the digital control panels. He is walking directly up to the physical breaker boxes for the secondary liquid cooling system. He is manually pulling the heavy steel levers downward. He is physically severing the power supply to the massive industrial pumps that circulate chilled glycol coolant through the floorboards. Silence stretched across the phone line, thick and heavy. Your golden boy manually shut down the cooling pumps to save on the electric bill, I continued. He turned off the only mechanical redundancy keeping those servers from overheating during a record-breaking heat wave. He bypassed the software-ignored warnings and baked those processors from the inside out. There is no virus. There is no cyber terrorism. There is just your son acting on the unearned authority you handed him, destroying a facility because he wanted to optimize a utility bill. Harrison let out a sound that was half gasp and half sob. He finally understood the absolute, undeniable reality of his situation. He could not blame a phantom hacker. He could not blame me. He had to look directly at the catastrophic consequences of his own nepotism. I took one final sip of my cold coffee and set the ceramic mug down on the granite counter with a sharp, decisive click. Call your corporate attorneys, Harrison, I said softly. You will need them when the medical consortium files their massive lawsuit tomorrow morning. I am going back to sleep. I ended the call instantly, cutting off his frantic apologies. I turned my phone completely off, walked back into my quiet bedroom, and pulled the comfortable blankets over my shoulders. Tomorrow was going to be an incredibly busy and very highly profitable day. While I slept peacefully in my air-conditioned house, completely detached from the chaos I had left behind, the true nightmare was just beginning to unfold across the entire state of Texas. The historic heat wave outside did not relent, trapping the city under a thick, suffocating blanket of oppressive humidity and soaring temperatures. The massive concrete bunker of Apex Solutions, now completely stripped of its secondary liquid cooling defenses by Brian's reckless hands, finally surrendered to the brutal, unforgiving thermal load. At exactly 3 in the morning, the ambient temperature inside the remaining operational server zones crossed the absolute critical threshold. Zone B, Zone C, and the highly fortified Zone D all reached exactly 115 degrees Fahrenheit simultaneously. The automated fail-safes, the final line of defense I had rigorously programmed years ago to prevent literal electrical fires from consuming the building, executed their hard-coded directives. Heavy metallic clacks echoed rapidly across the suffocating, pitch-black server floor as thousands of heavy-duty relays forcefully severed the main power connections. The deafening roar of the overworked internal cooling fans died instantly, replaced by an eerie, heavy silence that felt physically heavier than the sweltering heat itself. The blinding red emergency strobe stopped flashing, leaving the massive room in total darkness. The entire facility was completely dead. The heat wave had officially broken the system. But the true catastrophe was not the melted silicon inside that concrete box. It was the immediate digital vacuum created miles away. The entire medical database went entirely dark across 3 major state hospitals. The immediate, real-world consequences were terrifying and instantaneous. In downtown Dallas, a veteran trauma surgeon standing in a brightly lit operating room suddenly watched his digital monitoring screens turn completely black mid-procedure. He lost immediate access to the incoming patient's complex surgical history, specialized blood type records, and severe allergy profiles. Panic rippled through the experienced nursing staff as they scrambled to locate physical emergency binders that were hopelessly outdated and practically useless. Across town, the central emergency dispatch hub completely froze. Seasoned operators stared in absolute horror at blank monitors, entirely unable to track active ambulances or digitally route them to available trauma centers. The advanced algorithms that perfectly balanced critical patient loads across the entire state were completely gone. Emergency rooms were forced to initiate catastrophic diversion protocols, frantically radioing incoming paramedics to reroute critically injured patients to facilities entirely outside the affected network. Precious, life-saving minutes were lost as heavy ambulances slammed on their brakes and aggressively turned around on the dark highways, their sirens wailing frantically into the hot Texas night. The situation instantly escalated from a simple corporate hardware failure into a massive, unmitigated public health liability. Senior doctors were shouting at hospital administrators, aggressively demanding to know why the most critical infrastructure in the state had simply vanished without warning. Administrators were frantically dialing Harrison's phone, leaving furious, legally threatening voicemails. Human lives were actively hanging in the balance simply because a 22-year-old boy wanted to optimize a utility bill to look impressive on a generic spreadsheet. The Medical Consortium's command center tried desperately to ping the Apex Solutions servers, repeatedly initiating emergency backup handshake protocols, but they received absolutely nothing but dead air in return. The vital connection was permanently severed. Harrison drove his luxury sedan over 100 miles per hour down the empty interstate highway, his hands gripping the leather steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned entirely white. His expensive tires screeched loudly as he recklessly pulled into the Apex Solutions employee parking lot, violently hopping the concrete curb and parking diagonally across two handicapped spaces. He sprinted through the heavy glass front doors, completely bypassing the empty security desk, and burst directly into the primary administrative office suite. He did not find a team of dedicated technicians aggressively working to restore the failing system. He did not find emergency crews assessing the physical damage. He found Brian. The golden boy was sitting on the carpeted floor in the corner of my old office, his knees pulled tightly to his chest, openly sobbing like a frightened child. Brian was shaking violently, his expensive designer shirt completely soaked in sweat, completely surrounded by dark, lifeless computer monitors. Harrison did not offer a single word of comfort to his terrified son. He did not ask if Brian was physically okay. He marched straight past the crying boy and aggressively yanked open the heavy steel doors leading directly to the main server floor. A physical wall of stagnant, blistering heat washed over him instantly, forcefully knocking him backward half a step. The air inside the large room smelled strongly of melted plastic, scorched copper wiring, and completely fried motherboards. He walked slowly over to the primary operational dashboard, holding up his cell phone flashlight to illuminate the dead screens. The absolute silence of the cavernous room was far more terrifying than any loud emergency alarm could ever be. He shined his weak flashlight down the long aisles of server racks. The expensive hardware was completely motionless, essentially baked into useless blocks of metal. Harrison slowly lowered his phone, the stark reality of the situation finally crushing the remaining breath from his lungs. The master contracts, the multi-million-dollar service-level agreements, the professional reputation he had spent decades building, were all turned to complete ash in a matter of hours. And walked back into the administrative office. He looked down at the crying boy still sitting pathetically on the floor. Brian looked up at his father, his face completely covered in tears, desperately waiting for Harrison to magically fix the problem, to yell at someone else, to somehow make the monumental disaster disappear. But Harrison had absolutely no one left to blame. He could not blame a malicious hacker. He could not blame me. In a single night, his son's staggering arrogance and his own blind nepotism had completely destroyed the entire company. The thriving empire was permanently gone, replaced entirely by tens of millions of dollars in impending legal liabilities and gross criminal negligence charges. The absolute end had officially arrived. The absolute end had officially arrived for Harrison. But for me, the morning was just getting started. Sunlight poured through the large bay windows of my living room, painting the hardwood floors in warm golden hues. The air conditioning hummed a quiet, steady rhythm, standing in stark contrast to the boiling nightmare unfolding 20 miles away. Sitting on my plush linen sofa, surrounded by the comforting scent of freshly brewed espresso, I watched the local news channel with rapt attention. Samantha sat to my left, her hands wrapped tightly around a steaming ceramic mug, her eyes wide as she stared at the flat-screen television. Jamal stood behind us, leaning against the kitchen island, already dressed in a crisp, tailored white dress shirt and dark suit trousers. We were not watching the weather report anymore. The historic heat wave had been entirely eclipsed by an unprecedented infrastructure crisis. The local news broadcast had abandoned their regular morning programming entirely. The screen was split into 4 live camera feeds, each showing a different local hospital plunged into absolute administrative chaos. News helicopters circled above the massive medical complexes, capturing long, stationary lines of red and white ambulances backed up into the crowded streets. The lead anchor, a usually composed man with perfectly styled silver hair, looked visibly shaken as he read the breaking news alerts, scrolling rapidly across his teleprompter. He announced that a catastrophic data failure had completely paralyzed 3 major state hospitals overnight. He described veteran doctors resorting to whiteboards and paper charts, emergency rooms locked down in diversion mode, and thousands of critical patient records rendered completely inaccessible. State health officials were already organizing an emergency press conference demanding immediate answers from the third-party data management firm responsible for the sudden blackout. They are not using Harrison's company name on the broadcast. Yet, Samantha noted softly, her eyes darting across the scrolling news ticker at the bottom of the screen. They will by noon, Jamal replied smoothly, taking a slow sip of his black coffee. The state regulatory boards are already mobilizing. The medical consortium has a strict legal obligation to disclose the source of the failure to the public health department. Harrison is currently hiding behind closed doors, but the spotlight is moving incredibly fast, and it is pointed directly at his entirely empty server room. Right on cue, Jamal's cell phone began to vibrate violently on the granite kitchen island. He did not even flinch. It had been ringing continuously for the last 45 minutes. The caller ID flashed the names of terrified hospital board members, furious chief medical officers, and panicked consortium executives. They were demanding immediate legal action, searching for someone to publicly hold accountable for the multi-million-dollar disaster currently wrecking their operational budgets and threatening patient lives. Jamal placed his coffee mug down and picked up the phone. His entire demeanor shifted instantly. The relaxed, supportive husband vanished, replaced entirely by the ruthless, high-powered corporate attorney who commanded 7-figure retainers. He answered the call with a perfectly measured, authoritative tone. "Yes, Richard, I am watching the broadcast now. I already have the injunction drafted. The failure is absolute." Jamal listened intently for a few moments, nodding sharply as the frantic voice on the other end of the line spilled out of the earpiece. "Do not let them spin this as a force majeure event," Jamal commanded, his voice slicing through the executive's panic. "The heat wave is legally irrelevant. We explicitly baked the key personnel clause into the service level agreement for this exact reason. Harrison fired the only certified infrastructure expert capable of managing extreme thermal events and replaced her with an unqualified dependent. That is not an act of God. That is gross corporate negligence. We are not just terminating their contract. We are holding them financially liable for every single delayed surgery, every rerouted ambulance, and every hour of system downtime. I am heading to the courthouse to file the breach of contract papers right now." Jamal ended the call and tossed the phone into his leather briefcase. He snapped the heavy brass locks shut with a sharp, satisfying click. He walked over to the sofa, grabbed his tailored suit jacket, and slid it smoothly over his shoulders. He adjusted his silk tie and looked down at me with a sharp, calculating smile. "The trap is officially sprung," Jamal said, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the impending legal slaughter. "Harrison just handed me the easiest breach of contract lawsuit of my entire professional career. By the time the markets close today, his company will be legally barred from accessing any consortium data, and Harrison will be personally named in a 9-figure class action lawsuit. Keep your shadow servers hot, Kendra. I am going to make them legally desperate for a new host before lunch." "Go get them," I replied, raising my espresso cup in a silent toast. Jamal kissed Samantha on the cheek, grabbed his briefcase, and strode confidently out the front door. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him, leaving the living room bathed in the glow of the chaotic television broadcast. I leaned back into the soft cushions, feeling a profound sense of absolute vindication wash over me. The empire Harrison stole was burning to the ground, and I was watching the ashes fall from the comfort of my own home. Suddenly, my personal cell phone buzzed in my lap. I picked it up and glanced at the glowing lock screen. It was a direct text message from Harrison. I unlocked the device and opened the message thread. The text was incredibly short, entirely devoid of his usual arrogance and reeked of absolute soul-crushing desperation. "Name your price. Come fix this." I stared at the 6 words on the bright screen. I could picture him, standing in the sweltering, ruined server room, completely surrounded by dead hardware and a crying son, finally realizing that all his money and unearned authority could not bend the laws of thermodynamics or write a single line of viable code. He thought he could just buy his way out of the consequences. He actually believed that my loyalty, my expertise, and my dignity were commodities he could simply purchase back after throwing me away. He thought a blank check would make me forget the disrespect, the blatant theft of my intellectual property, and the dangerous nepotism that caused this entire disaster. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy. I did not feel the urge to gloat or send a scathing reply. He was no longer a threat. He was just a desperate, ruined man standing in the wreckage of his own monumental stupidity. I calmly swiped my finger to the left across his name. A bright red trash can icon appeared on the screen. I tapped it once. The message vanished, instantly deleted into the digital void without a single response. I placed the phone face down on the coffee table and turned my attention back to the television screen. The anchors were now interviewing a frantic hospital administrator who was visibly sweating in front of the emergency room doors. The administrator was begging the public to avoid the hospital unless they were experiencing a life-threatening trauma. The sheer scale of the disruption was staggering, and I knew exactly what had to happen next. The consortium could not wait weeks for a drawn-out legal battle to settle before restoring their data. They needed a functional, secure, and immediate solution to get their hospitals back online today. They needed my proprietary disaster recovery protocols, the exact protocols I had safely migrated to my shadow infrastructure before walking out of Harrison's building. I stood up from the sofa and walked toward my home office. The legal demolition was in Jamal's capable hands. The public relations nightmare belonged entirely to Harrison. My job was to ensure that when the dust finally settled and the consortium came looking for a lifeline, my servers were polished, primed, and perfectly ready to catch them. While I was in my home office, meticulously running diagnostic checks on my pristine, climate-controlled server racks, Jamal was executing his part of the strategy with absolute, terrifying, surgical precision. The corporate headquarters of Apex Solutions was a towering monument to Harrison's inflated ego, wrapped in mirrored glass and heavy steel, located right in the heart of the downtown financial district. Normally, the sweeping marble lobby was a quiet, intimidating space designed to make visitors and smaller competitors feel entirely insignificant. Today, it was an absolute madhouse. The multi-line telephones at the front reception desk were ringing continuously, blending into an agonizing, unified, high-pitched screech. Mid-level corporate managers were practically sprinting across the highly polished floor, their faces pale and sweating, clutching printed diagnostic spreadsheets and frantically yelling into their mobile phones. The stench of absolute corporate panic hung heavy in the air, thick, sour, and undeniable. Jamal did not pause to absorb the chaos. He strode through the massive revolving glass doors with the predatory calm of a shark swimming through a school of bleeding, panicked fish. His tailored dark suit cut a sharp, imposing silhouette against the frantic, disorganized backdrop. He walked directly past the bewildered security guards, who were far too busy screaming into their two-way radios to even notice him approaching the private elevators. He walked straight up to the main reception desk. The executive administrative assistant, a young woman who looked like she was on the absolute verge of a complete nervous breakdown, held up a trembling hand to stop him. She stammered rapidly that Harrison was absolutely not taking any meetings today and that the entire executive floor was strictly off-limits to the public due to a severe internal infrastructure emergency. Jamal did not even break his stride or acknowledge her command. He simply flashed a cold, unyielding, entirely terrifying smile, adjusted his grip on his heavy leather briefcase, and confidently bypassed her desk. He stepped into the private executive elevator entirely unbothered by her protests, and smoothly swiped a master access keycard I had discreetly slipped into his suit pocket before he left our house that morning. The stainless steel doors slid open on the top floor, revealing a sprawling suite of offices that felt like a completely different world from the loud, panicked lobby downstairs. It was eerily, oppressively quiet up here. The thick, expensive carpet absorbed the sound of Jamal's heavy leather shoes as he walked purposefully down the long hallway, heading directly toward the heavy mahogany double doors situated at the very end of the corridor. He did not bother to knock. He gripped the polished brass handles and forcefully pushed the heavy doors open, stepping into Harrison's opulent, brightly lit corner office without a single ounce of hesitation. Harrison was standing nervously behind his massive custom desk. His expensive suit jacket was discarded carelessly on the floor, his silk tie was loosened and crooked, and his dress shirt was completely drenched in nervous sweat. He held his cell phone tightly to his ear, his voice cracking as he desperately pleaded with whoever was on the other end of the line. When he saw Jamal suddenly enter the room unannounced, the remaining color entirely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified, trapped animal. He recognized Jamal instantly. Everyone in the downtown corporate legal circuit knew Jamal. He was the most ruthless, highly effective, and entirely merciless corporate litigator the medical consortium kept on a permanent, seven-figure retainer. Harrison slowly lowered the phone from his ear, his hand shaking violently, ending his desperate call without even saying goodbye. Jamal walked slowly and deliberately across the expansive office. He did not say a single word. He maintained absolute, terrifying eye contact with the ruined man standing behind the desk. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a massive, heavily bound legal document. It was over 400 pages long, thick with sworn affidavits, automated system failure logs, and ironclad contractual clauses. Jamal lifted the heavy binder high into the air and slammed it down directly in the center of Harrison's pristine mahogany desk. The sharp, violently loud thud echoed like a physical gunshot in the quiet, tense office. Harrison physically flinched, jumping backward as if the binder itself was a live explosive device. "You have officially been served," Harrison Jamal said. His voice was incredibly smooth, deeply resonant, yet completely devoid of any warmth or basic human empathy. Harrison stared blindly at the terrifying black binder, his hands beginning to shake uncontrollably at his sides. "What is this?" he managed to whisper, his voice cracking pathetically under the immense crushing pressure. "That is the immediate, non-negotiable, and entirely permanent termination of your master service agreement with the Texas Medical Consortium." Jamal explained, smoothly, methodically unbuttoning his suit jacket and standing perfectly straight. "You are being formally charged with gross breach of contract. Furthermore, due to the severe life-threatening nature of the medical data blackout you intentionally caused this morning, we are filing secondary charges of extreme criminal negligence with the district attorney. And finally, that binder contains a formalized civil lawsuit demanding exactly $50 million in immediate compensatory damages for the staggering operational losses our network of hospitals has suffered in the last 6 hours alone." Harrison collapsed heavily into his expensive ergonomic desk chair as if his legs had suddenly been cut out from underneath him. He stared in sheer horror at the massive $50 million figure stamped in bold black ink on the cover page of the lawsuit. He started shaking violently, a full-blown panic attack completely hijacking his nervous system. "50 million," Harrison gasped, struggling violently to pull oxygen into his tightening lungs. "Jamal, you cannot do this. We are fixing it. I swear to you on my life, we are fixing it right now. I have my entire technical team working around the clock. Brian is down there right now, running emergency diagnostics on the primary cooling loops. Just give me 24 hours. Give me until tomorrow morning, and I will have the secondary liquid chillers fully operational again. The medical servers will be back online before the weekend. You have to call the consortium board. You have to tell them to give me a chance to make this right. We have been reliable partners for 10 years. You cannot just destroy my entire company over one single accident. Jamal leaned forward, placing both of his hands perfectly flat on the mahogany desk, aggressively invading Harrison's personal space with sheer, undeniable legal authority. He looked directly into Harrison's terrified, bloodshot eyes. "This was not an accident," Harrison Jamal stated coldly, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register that sent shivers through the room. "A hurricane taking out a municipal power grid is an accident. An unforeseeable hardware manufacturing defect is an accident. Allowing your completely unqualified, dangerously arrogant 22-year-old son to manually bypass automated thermal safety protocols just to save a fraction of a percent on a utility bill is gross, unforgivable, and entirely criminal negligence. You violated the key personnel clause the exact second you fired Kendra and locked her out of the building. You legally breached the contract before those servers even started melting." Harrison opened his mouth to argue, desperate to spin a new lie, desperate to find a loophole, but Jamal cut him off instantly. "Do not bother negotiating," Jamal commanded sharply. "The medical board does not care about your timeline, they do not care about your technical team, and they certainly do not care about Brian. They no longer trust you. They no longer trust your compromised facility. They no longer trust your completely fractured and incompetent leadership. As of this exact second, Apex Solutions is permanently barred from accessing, hosting, or transmitting any medical data belonging to the consortium. If you or your son attempt to reboot those destroyed servers and reconnect to our secure network without explicit written authorization, I will personally ensure you are both arrested by the FBI for federal cyber intrusion. Read the binder, Harrison. Call your bankruptcy attorneys. The contract is dead, and your company is entirely finished." Harrison stared at the massive black binder, as if Jamal had just placed a live, venomous snake directly on his pristine desk. The heavy silence in the expansive executive office was absolutely deafening, broken only by the frantic, rapid sound of Harrison struggling to pull oxygen into his tightening lungs. He slowly reached out his trembling fingers, grazing the thick, textured paper of the cover page. His bloodshot eyes scanned the dense legal jargon, desperately searching for any possible escape route, any typographical error that could buy him a few more hours of survival. His frantic gaze drifted down to the bottom right corner of the page, settling directly on the bold signature block. He read the name printed perfectly beneath the thick black line of ink. Jamal Vance, Senior Litigating Partner. Harrison blinked hard, his panicked brain desperately trying to process the information. The name Vance echoed loudly in his mind, striking a very specific, deeply buried memory. He stared at Jamal, his eyes aggressively darting across the sharp, uncompromising features of the lawyer's face. He remembered the annual Apex Solutions corporate holiday gala from 3 years ago. He clearly remembered Kendra walking into the crowded, brightly lit ballroom, holding a glass of champagne, standing next to her younger sister Samantha. And standing right beside Samantha was her husband, a highly successful, aggressively brilliant corporate litigator who had politely but firmly declined a lucrative job offer from Harrison's own legal department. The realization hit Harrison with the physical force of a speeding freight train. The sheer terror paralyzing his face instantly evaporated, completely consumed by a sudden, violent surge of unhinged rage. His complexion shifted rapidly from a sickly pale white to a deep, dangerous crimson. The thick veins in his neck bulged against his tightly fastened silk shirt collar. "You are her brother-in-law!" Harrison hissed the words, dripping with absolute, unfiltered venom. Jamal did not flinch. He did not blink. He simply stood there, adjusting his expensive silk tie with absolute, infuriating calm. "I am the lead counsel representing the Texas Medical Consortium," Jamal corrected smoothly. "My familial relationships have absolutely no bearing on the fact that your company just single-handedly destroyed $50 million worth of critical healthcare infrastructure," Harrison erupted. He slammed both of his heavy hands down onto the mahogany desk with terrifying force, completely ignoring the sharp pain shooting up his wrists. He aggressively kicked his expensive ergonomic chair backward, sending it crashing violently into the large, floor-to-ceiling glass window behind him. "This is a massive conspiracy!" Harrison screamed at the top of his lungs, spit flying from his trembling lips. "You and Kendra orchestrated this entire disaster from the very beginning. This was never about a cooling failure. This is a highly coordinated, premeditated extortion racket." Jamal remained perfectly still, watching the wealthy executive completely lose his fragile grip on reality. "She could not handle the fact that I promoted my own son over her," Harrison roared, pacing frantically behind his desk like a trapped rabid animal. "She was insanely jealous that Brian took her fancy title and her corner office. So she hatched this sick, twisted plot with her high-powered lawyer brother-in-law. She purposely programmed a malicious logic bomb into the primary servers before she walked out of this building. She intentionally forced the cooling pumps to shut down so she could crash the entire medical grid and hand you a $50 million lawsuit on a silver platter. You two set me up. You set my innocent son up. This is textbook corporate sabotage and illegal racketeering. I will personally have you both indicted under the Federal RICO Act. You are going to share a concrete cell with her in federal prison for the rest of your miserable lives." Harrison was rapidly hyperventilating now, his chest heaving violently as he frantically tried to construct a fictional narrative where he was the innocent victim of a malicious family conspiracy. He desperately needed to believe that his own actions, his own staggering arrogance, had not caused this monumental catastrophe. "Are you quite finished?" Jamal asked, his voice cutting through Harrison's frantic screaming like a freshly sharpened surgical scalpel. Jamal took one slow, deliberate step closer to the desk. The absolute lack of emotion in his dark eyes was utterly terrifying. He did not raise his voice. He did not yell. He simply began to clinically, systematically dismantle Harrison's pathetic defense. "Let us examine the concrete, undeniable facts of the situation," Jamal said softly, his deep voice resonating with lethal, legal authority. "My sister-in-law warned you. She sat in this exact office, looked you directly in the eye, and explicitly warned you that firing her would constitute a critical, non-negotiable breach of the key personnel clause. She explicitly warned you that the disaster recovery protocols were her personal, legally protected intellectual property, which you unlawfully attempted to claim as your own corporate asset." Harrison opened his mouth to shout another wild accusation, but Jamal raised a single commanding finger, instantly silencing the ruined executive. "Do not interrupt me," Jamal commanded softly. "Kendra did not engineer this disaster, Harrison. She simply refused to be a passive participant in your inevitable failure. You replaced a highly decorated 16-year veteran infrastructure expert with a frat boy whose only actual qualification was sharing your genetic code. Kendra did not march your arrogant son down into the subterranean utility levels. She did not place his hands on the heavy steel levers. She did not force him to physically sever the electrical supply to the automated secondary liquid chillers. Brian did that entirely on his own, completely bypassing the security software, because he desperately wanted to look like a corporate genius on his first monthly expense report." Jamal leaned forward again, placing his hands flat on the desk, towering over the broken man. "Your son manually destroyed the only cooling redundancy keeping those servers alive during a historic, record-breaking heat wave. And when the alarm started blaring, instead of calling the seasoned professionals you recklessly fired, your golden boy locked himself out of the administrative terminal because he forgot his own new password. We have the internal security camera footage. We have the automated digital keystroke logs. We have a massive mountain of hard, indisputable evidence proving that your son single-handedly baked those medical servers from the inside out while you were fast asleep in your mansion. Harrison fell completely silent, his breathing shallow and rapid. The wild, accusatory fire in his eyes flickered and died, permanently replaced once again by the cold, crushing weight of reality. There is no malicious logic bomb, Jamal continued, his voice echoing in the quiet office. There is no coordinated family extortion ring. There is no grand conspiracy out to destroy your legacy. You did this entirely to yourself. You handed the keys of a highly volatile, complex mechanical ecosystem to a complete amateur, and you acted incredibly shocked when he drove it straight into a brick wall. This is not a conspiracy, Harrison. It is simply the devastating, unavoidable consequences of your own blind nepotism. Jamal picked up his heavy leather briefcase from the floor. He buttoned his suit jacket and turned toward the heavy mahogany doors. The $50 million lawsuit is just the civil beginning, Jamal promised softly. By tomorrow morning, the district attorney will issue a formal criminal subpoena for Brian. I highly recommend you spend the rest of your afternoon finding a very good criminal defense attorney for your son. He is going to need one. Jamal's words hung in the air of that ruined executive suite long after the heavy mahogany doors clicked shut. But Harrison did not call a bankruptcy attorney. He did not call a criminal defense lawyer for his son. Desperation is a highly toxic emotion. It completely bypasses logic, rewrites reality, and forces ruined men to make catastrophically stupid decisions. He actually believed that because he had money, he could still somehow buy his way out of a $50 million coffin. 2 hours later, I was sitting calmly at my kitchen island. My laptop screen was filled with the glowing green metrics of my shadow infrastructure, completely stable and perfectly ready to absorb the massive medical data load the exact moment Jamal gave the legal signal. The quiet, peaceful sanctuary of my home was suddenly shattered by a series of violent, heavy thuds. Someone was aggressively pounding their bare fists against my solid oak front door. It was not a polite knock. It was a frantic, demanding barrage that rattled the brass hinges and echoed loudly through my calm living room. I slowly closed my laptop, walked down the short hallway, and glanced through the clear glass side panel next to the door. A sleek, black luxury sedan was parked entirely haphazardly in my driveway, the engine still running loudly. The front left tire completely crushing a line of my manicured marigolds. Standing on my front porch, sweating profusely in the brutal Texas afternoon heat, were Harrison and Brian. Harrison was violently banging his heavy fists against the wood. His face flushed a dangerous, unhealthy shade of crimson. Brian stood slightly behind him, looking genuinely terrified, but desperately trying to mask it. They were actively causing a massive, undeniable scene in my quiet, affluent suburban neighborhood. Mrs. Higgins from next door had already stepped out onto her porch, clutching her gardening shears tightly, openly staring at the two unhinged men assaulting my entryway. I unlocked the deadbolt and slowly pulled the heavy door open. I did not step aside to let them in. I stood firmly in the center of the threshold, physically blocking their entry, staring at them with absolute, freezing indifference. Harrison stopped mid-strike, his raised fist hovering awkwardly in the air. He lowered his arm, breathing heavily, his custom-tailored suit wrinkled, unbuttoned, and deeply stained with nervous sweat. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in a single morning. Brian, however, reacted to my presence with a sudden, pathetic display of forced corporate dominance. He aggressively puffed out his chest, trying to stand taller, attempting to project the unearned authority of an executive director. It was a completely laughable gesture from a boy who had just single-handedly melted tens of millions of dollars of life-saving medical hardware.
We need to talk.
Kendra Harrison demanded, his voice gravelly loud and incredibly frantic. He tried to step forward, attempting to push past me into the air-conditioned foyer, but I planted my feet securely on the hardwood floor, refusing to yield a single inch of my personal territory. "You are actively trespassing on my private property, Harrison," I stated coldly, keeping my voice low and completely steady. "State your business right now, or I am calling the police and having you forcibly removed from my porch." Harrison swallowed hard, his wild eyes darting nervously around the quiet street. He finally realized he had absolutely zero leverage. He was cornered, bleeding out financially, and I was the only person on the entire planet holding a functional tourniquet. "I am here to offer you your job back." Harrison blurted out the words, rushing from his mouth in a desperate, panicked torrent. "The company needs you. I am willing to completely overlook the horrible, malicious stunt your brother-in-law just pulled in my office. I am willing to wipe the slate entirely clean. I will give you your senior title back, and I will even give you a 10% raise on your base salary. We can drive back to the facility right now. You can load your proprietary disaster recovery software back into the mainframe, and we can get the entire medical consortium back online before the evening news cycle." I stared at him in complete, absolute silence. For a brief, fleeting second, I actually thought the crushing weight of the $50 million lawsuit had finally forced him to see reality. I thought the impending criminal charges had finally broken his massive ego. But then the true nature of his visit revealed itself utterly ugly and completely unrepentant. "There is just one minor condition," Harrison added hastily, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial whisper. He gestured slightly toward his sweating son. "Brian is still going to remain the director of data center operations. You will report directly to him, and when the State Regulatory Board holds their emergency press conference tomorrow morning, you and I are going to stand at the podium together. You are going to look directly into the news cameras and explicitly state that the outage was caused by a highly unpredictable, unavoidable hardware glitch in the secondary chillers. You will publicly confirm that human error had absolutely nothing to do with the meltdown. You will clear my son's name completely." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of his proposal hit me like a physical blow. It was so incredibly delusional, so profoundly disconnected from the catastrophic reality he was currently drowning in, that I almost laughed in his face. He was staring down the barrel of total corporate bankruptcy. His entire professional reputation was turned to ash. His company was legally banned from the medical network, and his only priority was still protecting the golden child? He actually expected me to walk willingly back into a burning building, accept a pathetic, insulting 10% raise, submit to the daily authority of the incompetent frat boy who started the fire, and then publicly commit federal perjury to shield that exact same boy from the legal consequences of his own disastrous actions. He wanted me to fall on my own professional sword to save his arrogant son. Brian smirked slightly, crossing his arms tightly over his chest, clearly believing that the promise of a slight pay bump would instantly bring the disgruntled, emotional employee back in line. He actually thought he was winning the negotiation. I looked directly at Brian. I looked at the smug, deeply entitled smirk resting easily on his perfectly average face. Then I looked back at Harrison. I did not feel anger anymore. I did not feel the burning, chaotic desire for revenge. I felt absolutely nothing but pure, unadulterated disgust. I was staring at a massive, impenetrable wall of corporate delusion. They were completely incapable of acknowledging their own spectacular failures. They were parasitic executives perfectly content to feed off the hard-earned expertise of others while taking all the credit and completely dodging the accountability when things went horribly wrong. They were still trying to protect the golden child at my direct expense. "You are entirely out of your mind, Harrison," I said softly, the quiet volume of my voice making the words hit significantly harder than any scream ever could. Harrison blinked rapidly, his desperate, pleading smile faltering slightly. "Kendra, please be reasonable. $50 million will completely destroy the company. It will completely ruin my family." "Your family ruined your company," I corrected instantly, my tone completely merciless and utterly cold. "I am not your savior, Harrison. I am not your scapegoat, and I am absolutely never, under any circumstances, going to work for your incompetent son. Your golden boy manually destroyed the critical infrastructure, and now you both get to choke on the ashes alone." I stepped backward into my foyer and placed my hand firmly on the heavy brass doorknob.
Do not ever come to my house again.
I slammed the solid oak door shut directly in their faces, engaging the heavy deadbolt with a loud, absolute, and deeply satisfying final click. The heavy deadbolt clicked securely into place, but the absolute silence inside my cool, air-conditioned foyer lasted for exactly 4 seconds. The violent, frantic pounding on the solid oak door immediately resumed, echoing through the quiet house with double the intensity. Harrison had completely lost whatever thin veneer of professional sanity he had left. He was literally screaming my name through the thick wood, his muffled voice cracking with absolute, unhinged hysteria. Beside him, I could hear Brian yelling as well, violently rattling the heavy brass doorknob, aggressively demanding that I open the door and show his father the respect he deserved. The sheer blinding entitlement was staggering. They were not leaving. They were actively escalating a massive corporate dispute into a physical altercation right on my front porch, completely oblivious to the public spectacle they were creating in my quiet neighborhood. I reached into my back pocket, pulling out my personal cell phone, fully prepared to dial the local police precinct and request an immediate squad car to remove the trespassers. But before I could unlock the bright screen, a large, comforting hand gently covered my own. I turned around quickly. Jamal had walked out from the living room and was standing right beside me in the narrow foyer. He was casually holding a freshly brewed cup of dark roast coffee in his left hand, the steam curling slowly into the cool air. He had taken off his tailored suit jacket and loosened his expensive silk tie. But even in his relaxed state, he projected an aura of absolute, terrifying authority. He looked at the violently rattling door, took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee, and gave me a single, silent nod. "Let me handle this," Jamal said softly, his deep voice perfectly calm and completely steady. Jamal reached forward and smoothly disengaged the heavy deadbolt I had just locked. He firmly grabbed the polished brass handle and forcefully yanked the solid oak door entirely open, stepping directly out onto the sun-baked concrete porch. Harrison and Brian physically stumbled forward, caught entirely off guard by the sudden lack of resistance. They had fully expected to see my face, perhaps hoping I had been intimidated by their highly aggressive display. Instead, they found themselves staring directly into the cold, merciless, unblinking eyes of the exact same senior corporate litigator who had just handed them a $50 million death sentence 2 hours ago. The sudden, drastic shift in power was instantaneous and practically tangible. Harrison froze completely, his raised fists dropping heavily to his sides, the angry red color draining from his face so fast, he actually looked physically ill. Jamal stood firmly on the top step of the porch, looking down at the two ruined executives as if they were a pair of rabid stray dogs digging through his trash. He did not yell. He did not raise his voice a single decibel. He simply took another slow, highly deliberate sip of his coffee. "You have exactly 10 seconds to explain why you are violently assaulting my sister-in-law's front door," Jamal stated. His voice was incredibly quiet, but it carried a lethal, chilling edge that completely cut through the oppressive, suffocating Texas heat. Harrison opened his mouth to speak, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He just stared at Jamal, absolutely paralyzed by the terrifying realization that he had unknowingly brought his pathetic corporate tantrum directly to the doorstep of the exact man currently orchestrating his total financial ruin. Since you seem entirely incapable of forming a coherent sentence, Harrison, I will make this incredibly simple for you. Jamal continued smoothly, his dark eyes locking aggressively onto the older man. This is your first and absolute final warning. If you ever drive your car into this neighborhood again, if you ever step foot on this property, or if you ever attempt to contact Kendra via phone, email, or carrier pigeon, I will immediately file a comprehensive civil harassment lawsuit against you. I will personally drag you in front of a federal judge, and I will ensure that the district attorney files secondary criminal stalking charges against both you and your son. Do you fully comprehend the monumental legal gravity of what I am telling you right now? Brian, still desperately clinging to the absolute delusion that he possessed any actual power, suddenly decided to intervene. He forcefully puffed out his chest, stepping aggressively in front of his ruined father, desperately trying to manufacture a dominant, commanding posture. "You cannot talk to us like that," Brian yelled, his voice cracking embarrassingly high in the humid air. "My father built that company from the ground up. She owes us her entire career. She is going to get in the car, come back to the facility, and fix the cooling pumps right now, or we are going to sue her for everything she has." Jamal slowly lowered his ceramic coffee cup. He shifted his freezing gaze from Harrison directly to the sweating 22-year-old boy. Jamal was a towering, heavily built man, standing well over 6 feet tall. He smoothly stepped forward, completely closing the physical distance between them, aggressively invading Brian's personal space. Jamal physically dwarfed the terrified frat boy. The sheer, undeniable, intimidating presence of the seasoned corporate litigator was absolutely suffocating. Brian instantly shrunk back, his forced bravado evaporating entirely under Jamal's lethal stare. The young boy's hands began to visibly tremble at his sides. "You do not have a company anymore, Brian Jamal," whispered his deep voice, dropping to a dangerous gravelly register. "You melted it. You manually destroyed $50 million worth of critical medical infrastructure because you are completely, unforgivably incompetent. You are not a corporate executive. You are a massive walking legal liability, and if you ever raise your voice on this porch again, I promise you, the very next time you speak, it will be directly to a federal judge during your criminal deposition under oath." Brian swallowed hard, completely silenced, his eyes wide with absolute, genuine terror. He finally realized he was not protected by his father's money or his unearned corporate title anymore. He was entirely exposed to the brutal reality of his actions. Jamal gracefully raised his left hand and pointed a long, commanding finger directly at the black luxury sedan parked haphazardly on top of my crushed marigolds. "You have exactly 30 seconds to get off this property before I call the local police and have you both immediately arrested for criminal trespassing," Jamal ordered coldly. Harrison did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. The fight had been completely and violently beaten out of him. He grabbed Brian by the back of his sweat-soaked designer shirt and practically dragged his terrified son down the concrete steps. They practically sprinted across the perfectly manicured lawn, scrambling aggressively into the heavy luxury sedan, like terrified rodents fleeing a burning building. Harrison slammed the expensive car into reverse, the tires loudly screeching against the hot asphalt as he backed out of the driveway in a desperate, chaotic panic. Jamal stood silently on the porch, holding his coffee, watching the sleek black car speed recklessly down the quiet suburban street until it completely disappeared around the corner. They were finally gone, having completely realized they held absolutely zero leverage in this fight. Jamal took one final sip of his coffee, turned around smoothly, and walked back into the cool, air-conditioned foyer, gently pulling the solid oak door shut behind him. Jamal locked the heavy deadbolt turned to face me in the quiet foyer and offered a sharp, incredibly satisfying smile. The pathetic distraction on my front porch was officially over. Now it was time for the actual main event. We had exactly 2 hours to prepare before delivering the final, lethal blow to Harrison's non-existent empire. At exactly 2 o'clock that afternoon, Jamal and I walked through the towering glass doors of the Texas Medical Consortium headquarters in downtown Austin. The atmosphere inside the massive executive boardroom was thick with absolute, undeniable panic. 15 highly paid hospital administrators, chief medical officers, and senior board members were gathered around a massive mahogany table, practically shouting over one another. The giant digital monitors mounted on the walls, which usually displayed live operational metrics across their hospital network, were entirely black. The room smelled of stale coffee, expensive cologne, and sheer desperation. They were bleeding millions of dollars every single hour, and far more importantly, they were entirely blind to the critical medical needs of thousands of patients. Every second that ticked by increased their legal and ethical liability. When Jamal loudly cleared his throat, the chaotic shouting abruptly stopped. Every single desperate eye in the room locked onto us. They recognized Jamal immediately as their apex legal predator, the man they paid handsomely to destroy their corporate enemies. However, their confused gazes quickly shifted to me, desperately trying to place my face and figure out why I was standing beside him. Ladies and gentlemen, Jamal began his deep voice effortlessly, commanding the massive room. You are all acutely aware that we have formally terminated our master service agreement with Apex Solutions due to gross, catastrophic negligence. Harrison and his entirely incompetent management team have permanently compromised your primary physical servers. The hardware is literally melted. However, I am not here to simply deliver bad news. I am here to introduce you to the only person on this planet who can pull your hospital network out of the dark ages today. Please allow me to introduce Kendra, the founder and chief executive officer of Aegis Data Security. A senior hospital administrator, a woman with tight gray hair and a deeply stressed expression, leaned forward aggressively. Wait a minute, she snapped, pointing a trembling finger at me. I know you. You are the senior infrastructure engineer from Apex Solutions. You are Harrison's employee. We do not want anyone associated with that ruined, negligent facility touching our systems ever again. I stepped smoothly up to the edge of the massive boardroom table, placing my sleek laptop down on the polished wood. I am not Harrison's employee, I corrected her, my voice calm, steady, and projecting absolute professional authority. I resigned from my position yesterday morning, explicitly because Harrison demanded I hand over the operational controls of your highly sensitive medical database to an unqualified amateur. I absolutely refuse to compromise your patient's safety. But more importantly, I am here today because I anticipated Harrison's catastrophic failure years ago. The room fell completely silent. The sheer confidence in my voice anchored their frantic attention. They stopped looking at their dead cell phones and focused entirely on me. When I initially designed the disaster recovery protocols for your network, I built a secondary failsafe that Harrison never bothered to comprehend. I explained, opening my laptop screen. The primary servers sitting in his concrete bunker were always vulnerable to human error. To ensure absolute compliance with federal healthcare data regulations, my independent LLC maintained a legally separate, fully encrypted, air-gapped cloud backup of your entire operational database. It runs parallel to the physical servers, completely insulated from any localized hardware meltdown. It was perfectly legal, fully compliant with your previous service level agreements, and entirely outside of Harrison's control. He was merely the landlord of the physical boxes. I was the actual architect of the data. The chief medical officer, a tall man who looked like he had not slept in 3 days, stood up slowly, his hands planted firmly on the table. "Are you telling this board that our data is not permanently lost?" he asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and sudden, desperate hope. "Are you telling us you have our patient histories?" I turned my laptop around, pushing it slightly toward the center of the table. The screen glowed with the bright, active metrics of my shadow infrastructure. "I have absolutely everything I stated clearly. I have your live surgical schedules, your emergency dispatch routing algorithms, your complete patient allergy profiles, and every single digital asset that went dark at 3 o'clock this morning. It is all safely resting on my hypersecure cloud environment, perfectly intact and completely uncorrupted by the thermal failure at Apex Solutions." A chaotic wave of frantic whispers erupted across the boardroom. The profound relief washing over the executives was practically tangible. The gray-haired administrator leaned forward, again her aggressive posture entirely gone, replaced by urgent necessity. "How long will it take to transfer the massive data load to a new host?" she demanded. "How many days until we can get our emergency rooms fully operational again?" "I do not need days," I replied coldly, tapping a single key on my keyboard. "I hold the direct decryption keys. The virtual environment is already fully provisioned and standing by. The exact second you authorize the connection, I can securely route the active data streams directly back into your hospital terminals. Your emergency rooms will be fully operational, and your doctors will have their screens back in exactly 45 minutes. The board members were absolutely astounded. They stared at me with wide eyes, completely processing the staggering magnitude of my foresight. I had not just saved their operational budget. I had actively rescued their entire medical network from total collapse. Jamal stepped forward seamlessly, taking control of the room's energy. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of freshly printed, heavily bound contracts. He slid the documents across the polished mahogany table directly toward the board's internal legal counsel. "This is an exclusive 10-year master service agreement between the Texas Medical Consortium and Aegis Data Security," Jamal announced smoothly. "It completely bypasses Apex Solutions and establishes Kendra's company as the sole direct provider for your entire data infrastructure. The financial terms reflect the premium nature of the cloud environment she has meticulously maintained, and it includes ironclad clauses guaranteeing that no unqualified personnel will ever touch your systems again." The board's legal counsel rapidly scanned the first page of the contract, his eyes darting across the text. He looked up at the chief medical officer and gave a firm, decisive nod. The terms were absolutely flawless, perfectly designed to protect the hospitals while permanently cutting Harrison out of the lucrative ecosystem. There was no debate. There was no hesitation. The chief medical officer grabbed an expensive silver pen from the center of the table and rapidly signed his name across the bottom of the contract, pressing so hard the ink nearly bled through the heavy paper. The other senior administrators immediately followed suit, eagerly passing the document around the table to formally ratify the agreement. In less than 10 minutes, I had secured a massive, multi-million-dollar exclusive contract, instantly transforming my independent LLC into the most powerful data security firm in the state. Jamal collected the signed documents, placing them carefully back into his briefcase with a sharp, satisfying click. I turned my laptop back around, typed in my secure administrative credentials, and executed the final connection command. A bright green loading bar appeared on the screen, rapidly filling as the secure cloud handshake engaged. 45 minutes later, exactly as I promised, a deafening cheer erupted from the boardroom as the wall-mounted digital monitors suddenly flashed back to life, flooding the room with the beautiful, chaotic glow of restored medical data. Hospital cell phones began ringing with joyous reports from emergency rooms. My trap had worked perfectly. and I was now holding the undisputed keys to the kingdom. But in the high-stakes world of enterprise data management, a kingdom does not just silently change hands. The shift in power creates a massive, undeniable shockwave that completely fractures the surrounding corporate landscape. By 5 o'clock that same evening, the official press release from the Texas Medical Consortium hit the local financial wire. The announcement was professionally brief, but absolutely lethal. It publicly confirmed the immediate termination of their relationship with Apex Solutions due to catastrophic infrastructure failure, and proudly announced their new exclusive partnership with Aegis Data Security. In the cutthroat technology sector, loyalty is entirely conditional and driven purely by operational stability. When the largest, most prestigious client in a data center publicly abandons ship, the other passengers do not wait around to see if the boat is actually sinking. They instantly run for the lifeboats. The domino effect was staggering brutal and completely irreversible. Apex Solutions housed servers for dozens of other major corporate entities, including regional logistics firms, statewide credit unions, and massive e-commerce distributors. These companies all maintained highly paid risk management teams whose sole purpose was to monitor vendor stability. The exact moment the consortium press release went live, every single risk manager in the state of Texas simultaneously slammed the panic button. Their automated monitoring systems had already recorded the terrifying fluctuations in Harrison's cooling grid. They had seen the thermal spikes. Now they had public confirmation that the facility was critically compromised by human incompetence. Within exactly 12 hours, the mass exodus officially began. The heavy mahogany doors of Harrison's corporate headquarters, which were usually opened for celebratory champagne toasts, were suddenly violently kicked open by angry corporate attorneys from every major sector of the economy. They marched into the administrative suite, waving their heavily modified service level agreements. They cited the exact same key personnel clause that Jamal had weaponized. They cited the extreme breach of environmental safety protocols. Every single one of them aggressively triggered their emergency escape clauses. They demanded immediate server migrations and threatened massive secondary lawsuits if a single byte of their proprietary data was lost in the chaos. Harrison spent the next 48 hours trapped in a waking nightmare. He ran frantically from conference room to conference room, his expensive suits wrinkled and soaked in sweat, begging his clients to stay. He made wild, desperate promises he could never keep. He offered impossible discounts, free hosting periods, and personal financial guarantees, but his words were completely hollow. He was a ruined man, standing in front of a smoking crater, trying to sell luxury real estate. The clients simply stared at him with cold, unforgiving eyes, signed their termination papers, and walked out the door forever. In exactly 2 days, Apex Solutions went from a thriving, multi-million-dollar enterprise to a completely empty, highly toxic liability. The rapid, undeniable loss of 90% of their client base triggered the final, most devastating phase of the collapse. Corporate investors are notoriously skittish, and venture capital firms have absolutely zero tolerance for negative public relations combined with total revenue failure. The private equity board that heavily backed Harrison's recent aggressive expansion did not even bother to call him. They held an emergency remote vote at midnight. By sunrise, they completely pulled their remaining funding, aggressively executing their emergency divestment strategies to shield their own portfolios from the impending blast radius. The immediate withdrawal of venture capital triggered an automatic red flag at Harrison's primary financial institution. The massive commercial bank holding the operational accounts for Apex Solutions analyzed the situation with ruthless robotic efficiency. They saw the $50 million pending lawsuit from Jamal. They saw the total evaporation of monthly recurring revenue. They saw the impending criminal negligence charges. Acting purely on algorithmic self-preservation, the bank instantly froze every single corporate account associated with Apex Solutions. The massive credit lines were permanently severed. The payroll accounts were completely locked. Harrison could not even authorize a $20 transaction to buy a cup of coffee for his exhausted, panicking receptionist. He was completely locked out of his own financial existence. As the walls rapidly closed in, the true nature of Brian's character was finally, violently exposed. He had spent his entire life heavily shielded by his father's wealth, completely insulated from the harsh consequences of reality. He liked the fancy title, the expensive suits, and the unearned respect of a corner office. But when the absolute terror of federal criminal charges and complete financial ruin finally pierced his bubble of arrogance, he simply could not handle the pressure. He did not stay to help his father navigate the wreckage. He did not offer to take responsibility for manually shutting down the cooling pumps. In the dead of night, while Harrison was aggressively pacing the floors of his ruined executive suite, trying to reach his unresponsive bankers, Brian was frantically tossing designer clothes into expensive leather suitcases in his luxury apartment. He maxed out his final personal credit card to buy a one-way, first-class plane ticket to a state with highly favorable asset protection laws. He left his expensive company car parked haphazardly at the airport terminal, with the keys still in the ignition. He did not leave a note. He did not call his father to say goodbye. The golden boy simply turned his phone off, boarded the plane, and cowardly fled the state, completely abandoning the man who had sacrificed his entire company just to stroke his son's fragile ego. On the morning of the 5th day, the brutal Texas heatwave finally broke, leaving behind a cool, gentle breeze. But inside the massive concrete bunker of Apex Solutions, the air was completely dead. The heavy glass front doors were heavily padlocked and draped with thick metal chains. Bright yellow foreclosure notices were aggressively taped to the expansive windows. Harrison sat entirely alone on a cheap folding chair in the center of the dark, silent server floor. The deafening roar of the massive industrial cooling fans was gone. The frantic blinking of millions of data processing lights was gone. His clients were gone. His investors were gone. His son was gone. He stared blankly at the massive, ruined metal racks, finally signing the thick stack of Chapter 7 bankruptcy papers resting on his knee. The data center was officially, entirely dead. Exactly 7 days after the final bankruptcy papers were signed, I walked out of my favorite downtown Austin coffee shop, holding a freshly made iced latte. The morning sun was bright, the air was warm, and my new company was already successfully onboarding 3 more regional hospital networks. I was entirely focused on the massive logistical expansion of my cloud environment, mentally reviewing the complex deployment schedules. Then, I saw him. Harrison was leaning heavily against the driver's side door of my new luxury sedan. He was entirely unrecognizable from the arrogant, perfectly tailored executive who had violently banged on my front door just 2 weeks prior. He was wearing heavily wrinkled, unwashed sweatpants and a deeply stained gray t-shirt. His face was covered in a thick, unkempt graying stubble, and his eyes were heavily bloodshot. As I walked closer, I realized his shoulders were violently, uncontrollably shaking. The former king of Texas Enterprise Data was standing in the middle of a busy public parking lot, openly weeping. I stopped exactly 5 feet away from my car door, keeping a highly secure distance, my expression completely neutral. I did not ask him if he was all right. I did not offer a single word of superficial comfort. I just stared at him. "Kendra, please," Harrison choked out, his voice cracking painfully in the humid air. He pushed himself off my car and took a desperate, stumbling step toward me. "The bank took all the corporate accounts. They completely locked down the physical facility. Now they are aggressively coming after my personal assets. The commercial lenders are initiating a rapid foreclosure on my private estate by this Friday. I am going to lose my house. I'm going to be completely out on the street." He aggressively wiped a steady stream of tears from his hollow, sunken cheeks, his chest heaving with sheer, unadulterated panic. "I need you to buy the physical building," he begged down, his voice dropping into a pathetic, desperate whine. "You have the massive medical contract now. You will eventually need physical server space. I will sell you the concrete bunker directly for pennies on the dollar. I will legally bypass the bankruptcy liquidators completely. Just give me enough liquid cash to satisfy the secondary mortgage on my house. Please, Kendra, I am begging you. Look at our long history together. I gave you your very first start in this brutal industry when you were just 18 years old. I mentored you. I treated you exactly like you were my own daughter." The sheer, highly calculated emotional manipulation was absolutely revolting. He was actively trying to weaponize the exact loyalty he had so easily destroyed. I looked at him with absolute, unbreakable ice. The Texas heat was already rapidly rising, but my voice was completely freezing. "You did not treat me like a daughter, Harrison," I stated coldly, stepping forward and aggressively hitting the electronic unlock button on my key fob. "You treated me like a highly profitable, easily disposable workhorse. You completely threw my entire decade of hard work away in a single afternoon, just to stroke the massive ego of a pathetic, entitled boy. You handed the critical keys of a life-saving medical facility to a son who literally could not even figure out how to keep the air conditioning running." I smoothly opened my heavy car door, sliding into the cool leather driver's seat. I looked back at his ruined, weeping face one final time. "You chose your golden child, Harrison. Now you get to live in his ruins." I slammed the car door shut, leaving him standing completely alone in the hot parking lot. I slammed the heavy car door shut, but I did not immediately put the engine into gear. Through the darkly tinted glass, I watched Harrison press his trembling hands against the warm metal of my window. His tears were heavily smearing against the glass, his mouth moving in rapid, silent, desperate pleas. He looked absolutely, fundamentally pathetic. A man who had built his entire identity on dominating others, a man who had mercilessly crushed his competitors and terrorized his employees, was now physically crumbling in a highly public parking lot. The sheer magnitude of his fall was breathtaking. I reached out and pressed the button on my leather armrest. The tinted window rolled down with a smooth, quiet electronic hum. The oppressive, suffocating Texas heat rushed back into the cool, air-conditioned cabin of my car, bringing with it the sharp smell of hot asphalt and Harrison's deeply nervous sweat. He gasped loudly, his bloodshot eyes lighting up with a sudden, foolish, entirely unearned surge of hope. He actually thought his cheap emotional manipulation had worked. He actually believed that after treating me like garbage, a few fake tears would magically erase his massive betrayal. He reached his shaking hand out, fully expecting salvation. I slowly, deliberately looked him up and down. I took in the heavily wrinkled, unwashed sweatpants. I took in the deeply stained shirt. I took in the violently trembling hands and the utter, complete destruction of his arrogant corporate facade. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel an ounce of sadness. I felt the profound, deeply empowering satisfaction of absolute, undeniable justice. "I am sorry, Harrison," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper, dripping with calculated, freezing sweetness. "I just handle administrative paperwork now. You will have to ask Brian to figure out your foreclosure." I hit the electronic button again. The heavy tinted window glided rapidly upward, completely cutting off his horrified, open-mouthed gasp. I smoothly shifted the car into drive, pressed my foot firmly onto the accelerator, and pulled cleanly out of the parking lot without looking back. As I merged onto the busy highway, I checked my rearview mirror one last time. Harrison had collapsed entirely onto his knees on the hot, unforgiving concrete. He was openly, violently sobbing, his face buried deeply in his hands, completely and utterly abandoned by the world he had tried to violently control. The next 4 weeks were an absolute blinding whirlwind of unprecedented, explosive corporate growth. The massive financial advance from the Texas Medical Consortium had officially cleared my business accounts, injecting an astronomical amount of liquid capital directly into the veins of Aegis Data Security. We were no longer just a clever shadow cloud environment operating out of my house. We were the undisputed apex predators of the regional data management sector. My sister Samantha had officially joined the company as a senior partner to manage our rapidly expanding human resources department, bringing order to the chaos. Jamal was legally securing new, highly lucrative municipal and government contracts by the hour, wielding our massive success like a legal broadsword. We were aggressively building a modern empire at breakneck speed. But a rapidly expanding digital empire eventually needs a heavily fortified physical fortress. Exactly 32 days after I left Harrison, weeping in the dirt, my cell phone buzzed loudly on my sleek glass desk. It was Jamal. The commercial bank had officially finalized the rapid foreclosure on Apex Solutions. The massive concrete bunker, the heavily fortified industrial-grade facility I had spent 16 years of my life meticulously building from the ground up, was going to a public bank auction at noon. The commercial real estate market had completely turned its back on the toxic property. The massive industrial cooling system was entirely destroyed. The internal server hardware was melted slag, and the toxic public reputation of the facility aggressively scared away any legitimate corporate buyers. It was a completely dead asset to everyone else. But to me, it was a perfectly reinforced, heavily shielded, industrial-grade shell. It was exactly what I needed to house my new, massively expanding physical server racks. I arrived at the county courthouse steps at exactly 11:45 in the morning. The auction was a cold, clinical, and completely unfeeling process. A bored, highly monotone bank liquidator stood at a small wooden podium, rapidly reading off the long legal descriptions of ruined commercial properties to a sparse, unenthusiastic crowd of vulture capitalists and local real estate flippers. When the specific address for the former Apex Solutions facility was finally announced, a heavy, deeply uncomfortable silence fell over the humid courtyard. No one wanted to touch it. The starting bid was set at a microscopic, highly insulting fraction of its original market value. I smoothly raised my numbered bidding paddle into the air. The liquidator briefly scanned the crowd, waiting for a competitive counteroffer that was absolutely never going to come. The massive venture capital firms were long gone. The commercial real estate developers fully knew the astronomical cost of replacing the industrial cooling grid was completely unmanageable. I was the only person standing in the humid courtyard who fully understood the exact, profound structural value of the heavy concrete walls and the heavily reinforced subterranean flooring. Going, once the liquidator droned monotonously, leaning heavily against his podium. Going twice. Sold to the young woman in the front row. I slowly lowered my paddle, a sharp, incredibly fierce smile spreading across my face. I had just legally purchased the massive physical heart of Harrison's former empire for absolute pennies on the dollar. I bought it using the exact same medical consortium money he had so carelessly, stupidly thrown away. The sheer, unadulterated poetic justice of the transaction was absolutely staggering. 2 hours later, I pulled my sleek luxury sedan into the massive, entirely empty parking lot of the facility. The heavy metal chains and the bright yellow foreclosure notices were already being aggressively removed by a private commercial locksmith I had hired on the drive over. I confidently walked up the wide concrete steps, grabbed the heavy metal handle, and forcefully pushed open the towering glass front doors. The massive, expansive server floor was completely dark and entirely silent. The air was incredibly thick and deeply stale. But as I walked slowly down the long, empty aisles between the ruined, melted metal racks, I did not see a corporate graveyard. I saw a massive, completely empty canvas waiting for my instruction. I reached out and ran my fingers lightly along the cold metal of a ruined server chassis. For 16 agonizing, deeply frustrating years, I had poured my absolute soul into this exact building. I had relentlessly sacrificed my nights, my weekends, and my personal life to ensure these highly complex systems never failed. I had meticulously built a digital fortress for an arrogant man who did not respect me, who gladly threw me to the wolves the exact second it benefited his highly incompetent, dangerously arrogant son. He had actively taken my loyalty, aggressively exploited my technical expertise, and tried to completely erase my entire professional existence. But I did not break under his pressure. I aggressively planned. I perfectly anticipated the inevitable disaster. I meticulously built a shadow infrastructure entirely in the dark. And when the golden boy finally predictably burned his father's massive house to the ground, I was the only one standing securely outside with the keys to the future. I walked to the exact center of the massive dark room and stopped. I took a deep, commanding breath of the stale air, feeling the profound weight of the moment. The heavy concrete facility was legally mine. The massive medical contracts were legally mine. The entire regional data security market was firmly resting in the palm of my hand. I was no longer an easily disposable, constantly overlooked employee. I was the undisputed architect, the sole owner, and the absolute ruler of the entire empire. Karma had been fully, completely, and violently delivered. 6 months later, the oppressive, stale silence of that massive concrete bunker had been completely eradicated. In its place was a beautiful, deafening, continuous symphony of pure technological power. I walked slowly down the primary central aisle of the completely renovated server floor. The air was perfectly chilled to a crisp, heavily regulated 68 degrees. Above my head, a massive, state-of-the-art liquid cooling matrix silently pumped hundreds of gallons of thermal regulating fluid through reinforced transparent conduits. The cheap, outdated environmental controls that Brian had so easily manually bypassed were completely gone. In their place, I had designed and installed a fully automated biometric security network that explicitly prevented any single human being from ever overriding the primary safety protocols. To my left and right, towering rows of sleek, jet-black server chassis stretched out as far as the eye could see. Millions of tiny green and blue LED lights blinked in rapid, chaotic harmony, representing the continuous, secure flow of petabytes of critical medical data, municipal records, and regional financial transactions. Aegis data security was no longer just a clever digital concept floating in a shadow cloud environment. It was a massive, physical, heavily fortified reality. It was a modern technological fortress, and it was operating at 100% flawless efficiency. The heavy biometric security doors at the far end of the central aisle hissed open with a sharp, satisfying pneumatic release. I turned away from the glowing server racks and smiled. Jamal and Samantha were walking toward me, completely bypassing the strict cleanroom protocols because they owned a massive percentage of the facility. Jamal was wearing his signature, perfectly tailored midnight blue suit, looking every bit the apex legal predator he was. But today, the heavy, intimidating scowl he usually reserved for terrified corporate executives was completely gone, replaced by a massive, genuine smile. Samantha walked right beside him, holding 3 expensive crystal tumblers and a heavy bottle of imported reserve champagne. She was wearing a sharp, modern gray blazer, radiating the absolute confidence of a senior executive who had just finished completely restructuring our rapidly expanding human resources department. We did not even wait to reach the executive boardroom. Right there in the middle of the freezing, deafeningly loud server floor, Samantha smoothly popped the cork on the heavy glass bottle. The loud, celebratory pop was instantly swallowed by the aggressive roar of the industrial ventilation fans. She quickly poured the golden liquid into the 3 crystal tumblers and handed them out. Jamal raised his glass high into the chilled air, his dark eyes shining with profound pride. He looked at the endless rows of perfectly functioning hardware, and then looked directly at me. To absolute, undeniable dominance, Jamal shouted over the ambient noise of the machines. And to the single greatest corporate checkmate I have ever had the distinct pleasure of witnessing in my entire legal career. We aggressively clinked our heavy glasses together, the sharp ring of the crystal echoing briefly against the metal racks. The cold, crisp champagne tasted exactly like absolute victory. As Jamal and Samantha began excitedly discussing the final logistical details of our upcoming state government expansion, I took a slow step back, allowing their voices to wash over me. I looked down the long aisle, staring at the exact physical spot where Brian had manually disabled the secondary chillers. The spot where Harrison's entire empire had literally and violently melted into the floor. The physical scars of that catastrophic disaster had been completely scrubbed away by my private contractors, but the deep, transformative memory of it remained permanently etched into my mind. For a very long time, I had genuinely believed that my professional worth was entirely tied to the senior title printed on my office door. I had foolishly believed that loyalty to a company was a mutually beneficial contract. I had allowed myself to become perfectly comfortable living in the shadows of an arrogant man, quietly fixing his massive mistakes, ensuring his unearned success, and accepting a fraction of the financial reward simply because it felt secure. I had handed the keys to my own professional destiny to a man who saw me as nothing more than an easily replaceable tool. But standing here now, surrounded by the overwhelming, tangible proof of my own undeniable expertise, I finally understood the truth. The profound, agonizing pain of Harrison's betrayal was absolutely necessary. His blind, arrogant cruelty was the exact catalyst required to violently push me completely out of my stagnant comfort zone. If he had never fired me to protect his wildly incompetent son, I would have spent the next 20 years of my life quietly maintaining his mediocre infrastructure, completely blind to my own staggering potential. He thought he was destroying my career, but he was actually just handing me the matches I needed to burn his fraudulent kingdom to the ground. True power in the modern corporate world does not come from a fancy title bestowed upon you by a disconnected board of directors. It does not come from the expensive suit you wear or the massive mahogany desk you sit behind. True, unshakable power comes entirely from the highly specialized expertise you actually own in your own head. It comes from the ability to anticipate the disaster before the fire ever starts. I was never a disposable employee. I was the absolute foundation of the entire operation, and the exact second I removed my support, the entire structure instantly collapsed into dust. I did not just survive their brutal attempt to ruin me. I aggressively weaponized their own profound incompetence and used it to completely consume them. I took one final, slow sip of the cold champagne, feeling a deep, unbreakable sense of peace settle entirely over my mind. The past was completely dead, and the future belonged entirely to me. Never hand the keys to your career to someone who sees you as disposable. When they try to take your office, buy the whole damn building. Have you ever watched an arrogant boss or a nepo baby destroy their own empire? Tell me your most satisfying karma stories in the comments below, and do not forget to like and subscribe for more